The year was 1925, and in a dimly lit beer hall in Munich, a failed Austrian painter sat surrounded by a handful of loyal followers. Adolf Hitler had just been released from Landsberg prison, his Nazi party banned, his political future seemingly finished. But as he spoke that evening about rebuilding his movement, one man listened with particular intensity. Heinrich Himmler, a chicken farmer's son with thick spectacles and a weak chin, would soon transform Hitler's personal protection detail into the most feared military force in human history. What began as 8 men with armbands would become nearly 1 million soldiers fighting across every theater of World War II. But this isn't just another story about Nazi Germany. It's the complex, controversial tale of how a security detail evolved into a parallel army, and how ordinary men became part of an organization that would forever blur the lines between soldier and criminal, between military service and war crimes. The story starts not with grand military parades or battlefield heroics, but with the mundane reality of Weimar Germany's political violence. In the chaotic years following World War I's end, German politics had become a blood sport. Communist revolutionaries battled monarchist paramilitaries in the streets. The young democracy teetered on the edge of collapse, and every political party needed protection for their leaders. Hitler's earliest bodyguards were a motley crew of World War I veterans, unemployed workers, and young idealists drawn to the Nazi message. They called themselves the Stahlstrupp Adolf Hitler, the Adolf Hitler Shock Troop. These weren't professional soldiers. They were brawlers and street fighters who earned their reputation breaking up opposition meetings and protecting Nazi rallies from communist disruption. But Heinrich Himmler had bigger dreams. When Hitler appointed him Reichsführer SS in 1929, Himmler inherited an organization of just 280 men. While other Nazi leaders saw the SS as nothing more than bodyguards in black uniforms, Himmler envisioned something far more ambitious, an elite order that would serve as the racial and ideological vanguard of the coming Nazi state. The transformation began slowly, almost imperceptibly. Himmler instituted strict racial requirements for SS membership, demanding proof of Aryan ancestry dating back to 1800. Height and physical fitness standards followed. Marriage permissions became mandatory, with brides subjected to racial examinations. What had once been a loose collection of political thugs was becoming a pseudo-religious order obsessed with racial purity and Germanic mysticism. The beer hall putsch of 1923 had taught Hitler valuable lessons about the limitations of street violence. When the Nazis returned to power through legal means, they would need more sophisticated instruments of control. The SS would be that instrument, but first, they had to survive the party's internal power struggles. In these early years, the SS existed in the shadow of the much larger SA, the Sturmabteilung, or stormtroopers. Led by Ernst Röhm, the SA numbered in the hundreds of thousands by 1933, a vast army of brown-shirt thugs who had literally fought the Nazis into power. But Röhm had his own ambitions, dreaming of incorporating his SA into the German army and becoming Germany's defense minister. This created a fundamental tension that would shape the SS early development. While the SA saw itself as a revolutionary army meant to overthrow the old order completely, Himmler positioned the SS as the elite guardian of Nazi ideology, smaller, more disciplined, absolutely loyal to Hitler personally. The contrast became stark during the final years of the Weimar Republic. SA men were known for their drunken brawling and indiscriminate violence. SS men, by contrast, were expected to embody Germanic virtues, discipline, loyalty, racial consciousness, and unwavering dedication to the Führer. They wore black uniforms instead of brown, carried themselves with military bearing, and cultivated an image of elite professionalism. But beneath this carefully crafted image lay a darker reality. Even in these early years, the SS attracted men who were drawn not just to Nazi ideology, but to the promise of power over others. The organization's emphasis on racial superiority and its member status as a chosen elite created a dangerous psychology that would have catastrophic consequences in the years to come. The economic collapse of 1929 provided the Nazis with their path to power. and the SS grew alongside the party's electoral success. By 1932, membership had swelled to over 50,000 men. These weren't just unemployed workers seeking purpose. The SS increasingly attracted middle-class professionals, university students, and even some aristocrats who saw in Himmler's order a return to traditional German values. Yet for all their pretensions to elite status, the SS remained primarily a police and security organization. Their main duties involved protecting Nazi leaders, infiltrating opposition groups, and maintaining intelligence networks. They had no military role, no combat training, and no legal authority beyond what the party granted them. Everything changed on January 30th, 1933, when Hitler became Chancellor of Germany. Within months, the SS found itself transformed from a party security service into an instrument of state power. They took control of police departments across Germany, established the first concentration camps, and began the systematic persecution of Jews, communists, and other perceived enemies of the Nazi state. But Himmler's ambitions extended far beyond police work. As early as 1933, he began discussing the need for an armed SS formation that could serve as a counterweight to both the German army and Rome's increasingly troublesome SA. The military leadership, particularly Defense Minister Werner von Blomberg, initially resisted any expansion of SS authority into military affairs. The tension came to a head in the summer of 1934. Ernst Röhm's SA had grown too powerful and too independent for Hitler's comfort. On June 30th, 1934, the night of the Long Knives, Hitler unleashed the SS against their former comrades. In a coordinated operation across Germany, SS men arrested and executed hundreds of SA leaders, including Röhm himself. The purge accomplished two crucial objectives. It eliminated the SA as a political threat and demonstrated the SS' absolute loyalty to Hitler. More importantly for our story, it cleared the way for the creation of an armed SS formation that would eventually become the Waffen SS. In the aftermath of the purge, Hitler authorized the formation of the SS Verfügungstruppe, the SS disposition troops. These weren't police or guards. They were armed soldiers trained for combat, organized into military units. The German army initially dismissed them as asphalt soldiers, parade ground troops suitable only for ceremonial duties. But what happened next would change everything. The SSVD formation, Himmler's vision of elite warriors, 1934 to 1939. The blood was barely dry from the night of the Long Knives when Heinrich Himmler walked into Hitler's office with a proposal that would reshape the nature of warfare itself. It was August 1934, and while the world focused on Germany's rearmament and the growing tensions in Europe, Himmler was quietly laying the groundwork for something unprecedented, a parallel army that would answer only to the SS, bound by ideology rather than traditional military doctrine. "My Führer," Himmler said, adjusting his wire-rimmed glasses, "we need armed formations that embody the true spirit of National Socialism. The Wehrmacht serves Germany, but the SS serves the idea." Hitler, still flush with the success of eliminating Rome and the SA leadership, nodded his approval. Neither man could have imagined that this conversation would eventually lead to nearly 1 million men fighting under the SS runes across 3 continents. The SS Verfügungstruppe, or SSVT, began with just 3 regiments: the Leibstandard SS Adolf Hitler in Berlin, Deutschland in Munich, and Germania in Hamburg. These weren't ordinary military units. From the beginning, Himmler insisted that SSVD soldiers undergo a fundamentally different kind of training, one that combined military skills with intensive ideological indoctrination. The man Himmler chose to lead this experiment would become one of the most controversial figures in military history. Paul Hauser, a retired Prussian general with a distinguished World War I record, seemed an unlikely candidate to join the SS. At 54, he was old enough to remember the Kaiser's army at its peak, yet pragmatic enough to see opportunity in Hitler's new Germany. When Himmler offered him command of the SS officer training schools in 1934, Hauser accepted, bringing with him decades of professional military experience. What Hauser found in the early SSVT was both promising and troubling. The recruits were undeniably motivated. Many were young idealists genuinely committed to Nazi ideology. They trained with an intensity that impressed even veteran soldiers. But their military knowledge was rudimentary, their equipment outdated, and their tactics more suited to street fighting than modern warfare. The German Wehrmacht viewed these developments with a mixture of amusement and concern. To career officers like Heinz Guderian and Erich von Manstein, the SSVD represented everything wrong with Nazi interference in military affairs. They were political soldiers, men whose loyalty was divided between their military duties and their ideological commitments. Traditional German officers had always prided themselves on being apolitical servants of the state, regardless of which government held power. But Hauser understood something that the Wehrmacht leadership initially missed. The nature of warfare was changing, and the coming conflict would require soldiers capable of fighting not just enemy armies, but entire populations. The SSVT's combination of military training and ideological commitment would prove devastatingly effective in a racial war that Hitler envisioned in Eastern Europe. The first major test came with the expansion of SSVD recruitment beyond Germany's borders. As early as 1935, Himmler authorized the recruitment of ethnic Germans from across Europe, Volksdeutsche who had lived for generations in countries like Romania, Hungary, and Yugoslavia. This was revolutionary thinking for its time. While traditional armies were based on national citizenship, the SSVD recruited based on racial criteria. A young farmer named Fritz Christen from the Banat region of Yugoslavia exemplified this new kind of soldier. Born to German-speaking parents who had lived in the Balkans for 2 centuries, Christen had never set foot in Germany until he volunteered for the SSVT in 1937. Yet within months of arriving at the training depot in Bad Tolz, he was fully integrated into a unit that would eventually fight from the Arctic Circle to the Caucasus Mountains. The training these men underwent was unlike anything in contemporary military doctrine. Days began before dawn, with physical conditioning that would have challenged Olympic athletes. Recruits learned to march 25 miles in full gear, cross rivers under fire, and fight effectively with whatever weapons they could capture from the enemy. But the physical training was only part of the program. Evenings were devoted to ideological education led by SS officers who had been carefully selected for their commitment to Nazi racial theory. Recruits learned that they were not just soldiers, but warriors in a racial struggle that would determine the future of European civilization. They studied maps showing the racial composition of Eastern Europe, learning to identify valuable Germanic populations that could be recovered and inferior Slavic peoples who stood in the way of German expansion. The psychological impact of this training was profound. Men like Hans Kruger, a bank clerk's son from Hamburg who joined the Germania Regiment in 1936, later described the transformation. We weren't just learning to fight, we were learning why we fought. Every drill, every exercise was connected to our mission as guardians of the race. It gave meaning to everything we did. But this ideological intensity came with a price. SSVD units developed a reputation for unnecessary brutality, even in training exercises. Live ammunition was used in maneuvers that would have employed blanks in regular Army units. Casualty rates during peacetime training were significantly higher than Wehrmacht averages. The SS justified these practices as necessary preparation for the racial war they expected to fight, but many observers worried about the psychological conditioning taking place. The Spanish Civil War provided the first real test of SSVT capabilities. When Hitler decided to support Franco's nationalist forces in 1936, he authorized the deployment of a small SSVT detachment as part of the Condor Legion. These men fought alongside Italian fascists and Spanish nationalists, gaining their first taste of modern combat, while testing tactics that would later be used across Europe. Lieutenant Colonel Wilhelm Bittrich, who commanded the SS detachment in Spain, reported back to Himmler with enthusiasm. Our men fight with a spirit I have never seen in conventional forces. They do not retreat, they do not surrender, and they show initiative that surprises even experienced Spanish officers. But Bittrich's reports also contained troubling details about the treatment of prisoners and civilians that foreshadowed much darker developments to come. The lessons learned in Spain accelerated SSVT development back in Germany. By 1938, the three original regiments had expanded into a full division-size formation. More importantly, they had begun to attract high-quality recruits from beyond the traditional Nazi base. University graduates, professional athletes, even some nobility joined units that offered rapid promotion and elite status within the new Germany. The Austrian Anschluss of March 1938 provided another crucial test. The Leibstandard SS Adolf Hitler participated in the triumphant entry into Vienna, providing security for Hitler's motorcade through the cheering crowds. But behind the pageantry, SSVD units were already demonstrating their willingness to undertake tasks that regular army units would have refused. Within hours of crossing the Austrian border, SSVT detachments began rounding up Jews, socialists, and other perceived enemies of the regime. They did this without specific orders, acting on the general authority granted by their ideological training. Wehrmacht generals were horrified, but Hitler was pleased. Here was a military force that understood the true nature of National Socialist warfare. The Sudetenland crisis of September 1938 further demonstrated the SSVT's unique role. While Wehrmacht units massed on the Czechoslovak border prepared for conventional military operations, SSVD formations infiltrated German-speaking areas to organize local supporters and gather intelligence. When the crisis was resolved without fighting, many observers credited the SSVT's preliminary work with making German occupation possible without bloodshed. But the most significant development came in early 1939 with the creation of the SS Stodden-Kopfverband, the Death's Head units responsible for guarding concentration camps. Initially separate from the SSVT, these formations shared the same ideological training and recruitment standards. The distinction between combat soldiers and camp guards was already beginning to blur, creating an organizational culture where military valor and criminal brutality could coexist. By the summer of 1939, the SSVT had evolved from Himmler's vision into a combat-ready force of over 18,000 men organized into 3 motorized regiments plus supporting units. They possessed some of the most modern equipment in the German military, including the latest tanks and communications gear. More importantly, they had developed a unique military culture that combined Prussian discipline with Nazi fanaticism. The final piece of the puzzle fell into place in August 1939 with the signing of the Nazi-Soviet Pact. Hitler was now free to launch his war of conquest without fear of a two-front conflict. The SSVT had been created for this moment, not just to fight Germany's enemies, but to implement the radical racial policies that would transform occupied Europe. As German forces massed along the Polish border in the last week of August 1939, SSVT commanders received their final briefings. They would fight as elite assault troops alongside the Wehrmacht, but they also carried special orders that regular army units had not received. The coming campaign would be more than a military conquest. It would be the first phase of a racial revolution. What happened next would test everything the SSVT had learned in 5 years of intensive preparation. First blood, Poland and the birth of military reputation, September 1939. At 4:45 a.m. on September 1st, 1939, the German battleship Schleswig-Holstein opened fire on the Polish garrison at Westerplatte, officially beginning World War II. But 200 miles to the south, in the pre-dawn darkness near the Polish town of Mlawa, another kind of history was being made. SS Oberfuhrer Felix Steiner crouched in a muddy ditch alongside his men from the Deutschland Regiment, watching Polish cavalry silhouettes moving against the gray sky. In a few hours, these SS soldiers would experience their first taste of modern combat and begin building a military reputation that would terrify enemies and allies alike. The SSVT went to war as part of Army Group North, attached to regular Wehrmacht divisions but maintaining their distinct identity and command structure. Unlike their army counterparts, who fought for territory and strategic objectives, the SSVT carried a dual mission. prove their military worth while implementing the racial policies that would transform occupied Poland into a laboratory for Nazi ideology. The Deutschland Regiment's first engagement came at dawn near the village of Przasnys. Polish defenders, many of them reservists called up just days before the invasion, had established defensive positions along a railway embankment. The SS troops attacked with a ferocity that shocked both enemies and Wehrmacht observers. Where regular army units might have used artillery preparation and methodical advances, the SSVT launched immediate frontal assaults, relying on superior training and fanatical motivation to overcome prepared positions. Sergeant Wilhelm Monk, a decorated World War I veteran now serving with the Leibstandard, later described the psychological impact. "We had trained for this moment for 5 years. Every man knew that Germany's future depended on our success. There was no question of retreat, no consideration of casualties. We were the racial elite, and we fought like it. But this aggressive tactics came at a terrible cost. SSVD casualty rates in the first week of fighting were nearly double those of comparable Wehrmacht units. At the Battle of Piotrkow Trybunalski on September 5th, the Germania Regiment suffered 40 casualties in a single afternoon while overrunning Polish defensive positions that could have been taken with minimal losses through proper artillery preparation. Wehrmacht generals were appalled by what they saw as unnecessary waste of elite troops. General Heinz Guderian, commanding the 19th Panzer Corps, complained directly to Army Group Headquarters. The SS units fight with courage, but their tactics belong to 1914, not 1939. They treat every engagement as a personal test of German superiority. Yet for all their tactical shortcomings, the SSVT was achieving something that traditional military units could not. They were inspiring absolute terror in enemy forces. Polish prisoners consistently reported that SS troops were more feared than regular German soldiers. Word spread through Polish units that surrender to the SS meant probable death, creating a psychological warfare effect that often caused enemy positions to collapse before SS attacks even began. The source of this fear became clear as the campaign progressed. Unlike Wehrmacht units, which generally observed traditional rules of warfare, SSVT formations routinely executed prisoners, particularly Polish officers and intellectuals identified as potential resistance leaders. These weren't random atrocities committed in the heat of battle. They were systematic actions carried out under standing orders from SS leadership. Lieutenant Hans Frank of the Totenkopf Division, which had been hastily converted from concentration camp duties to combat operations, kept a detailed diary of his unit's activities. September 8th, captured 47 Polish soldiers near Kutno. After interrogation, identified 12 as potential intelligentsia. Executed per standard procedure. Remaining prisoners transferred to rear areas. The coldly bureaucratic language concealed a horrific reality. SSVD units were implementing Einsatzgruppen-style policies even while engaged in active combat operations. Polish priests, teachers, lawyers, and government officials were systematically murdered, often in full view of Wehrmacht soldiers who had no authority to intervene. This created immediate tensions within the German military command. Field Marshal Walther von Brauchitsch, commander-in-chief of the German army, lodged formal protests with Hitler about SS conduct in Poland. Regular army officers complained that SS brutality was making their own jobs more difficult by hardening Polish resistance and creating international complications. But from Hitler's perspective, the SSVT was performing exactly as intended. The Polish campaign wasn't just about territorial conquest. It was the opening phase of a racial war that would reshape Eastern Europe. The SSVT's combination of military effectiveness and ideological ruthlessness made them ideal instruments for this dual mission. The Siege of Warsaw provided the most dramatic test of SSVT capabilities. The Leibstandard SS Adolf Hitler was assigned to support the final assault on Poland's capital, fighting house to house through the city's suburbs while Polish defenders mounted desperate resistance. Here, the SSVT's intensive training finally paid dividends. Their emphasis on individual initiative and small unit tactics proved perfectly suited to urban warfare. Corporal Joseph Sepp Dietrich, commanding a Leibstandard assault company, demonstrated the kind of leadership that would make SSVD units legendary among both friends and enemies. During the fighting for Warsaw's Ochota district, Dietrich personally led a platoon-sized attack against a Polish strongpoint in a fortified apartment building. When machine gun fire pinned down his men, Dietrich crawled forward alone, grenaded the position, then led the final assault with only a pistol and combat knife. Such individual heroics were becoming commonplace in SSVT units, creating a military culture that valued personal courage above tactical prudence. Men competed for the most dangerous assignments, viewing each combat mission as an opportunity to prove their racial superiority. This psychology produced remarkable battlefield achievements, but it also resulted in casualty rates that would have been considered unacceptable in any conventional military organization. The Polish campaign also revealed the first signs of the administrative chaos that would plague SS military operations throughout the war. SSVD units operated under a completely separate command structure from the Wehrmacht, receiving orders directly from Himmler's headquarters in Berlin. This created constant coordination problems with army units, duplicate intelligence gathering, and competition for the same logistical resources. Colonel General George von Kuckler, commanding the Third Army, reported to Army High Command. SS units under my operational control maintained separate radio networks, refused to share intelligence, and frequently undertake independent operations without informing Army headquarters. Their military value is offset by the command complications they create. But these organizational problems were overshadowed by the SSVT's growing reputation for battlefield effectiveness. By mid-September, even Wehrmacht officers who despised SS ideology had to admit that SS soldiers were among the most motivated and capable troops in the German military. Their losses were heavy, but they consistently achieved their objectives and rarely required reinforcement or relief. The campaigns brought both triumph and foreboding for the SSVT. They had proven themselves as combat soldiers, earning respect from enemies who had initially dismissed them as parade ground troops. But they had also demonstrated a willingness to commit atrocities that went far beyond anything seen in previous European conflicts. The statistics were sobering. SSVD units suffered over 1,400 casualties during the 36-day campaign, including 300 killed. But they had also participated in the murder of thousands of Polish civilians, the destruction of dozens of synagogues, and the systematic execution of captured Polish officers. The line between soldier and war criminal was already becoming impossible to draw. As German forces consolidated their conquest of Poland, SSVT units were among the first to be pulled back to Germany for rest and refitting. But they weren't returning to peacetime garrisons. Intelligence reports indicated that Britain and France were mobilizing for a long war, and Hitler was already planning offensive operations in Western Europe. The Polish campaign had been the SSVT's baptism of fire. They had proven they could fight, but they had also revealed a capacity for brutality that would define their entire wartime existence. As trains carrying SS soldiers rolled west through the German countryside in October 1939, many veterans sensed that Poland had been merely the beginning of something much larger and more terrible. What awaited them in France would test not only their military skills, but their capacity to function as soldiers rather than simply instruments of racial ideology. Blitzkrieg Baptism, France and the Low Countries, 1940. The morning mist hung thick over the Dutch countryside as SS Oberfuhrer Felix Steiner adjusted his field glasses and studied the enemy positions across the Isel River. It was May 10th, 1940, and after 8 months of the phony war, Hitler had finally unleashed Fallgelb, the offensive that would decide the fate of Western Europe. But for Steiner and his SSVD soldiers, this campaign would prove something far more significant than German military superiority. It would establish the Waffen SS as an elite combat force capable of matching the Wehrmacht's finest divisions. The transformation had been remarkable. During the winter of 1939-40, while Britain and France mobilized their armies and prepared defensive positions, Himmler had used the breathing space to completely reorganize his armed SS formations. The scattered regiments of the SSVT were consolidated into proper divisions, equipped with the latest German weapons and trained according to lessons learned in Poland. Most importantly, they had a new name that would become synonymous with military excellence and criminal brutality: the Waffen SS. Heinrich Himmler himself had coined the term, combining the German word for weapons with the SS initials to emphasize that these were fighting soldiers, not merely police or security troops. The name change reflected a fundamental shift in how these formations saw themselves and how others would remember them. The Leibstandard SS Adolf Hitler had been expanded into a full motorized regiment, while the Deutschland and Germania regiments formed the core of a new SS division called Das Reich. A third division, Totenkopf, was created from the concentration camp guards who had fought in Poland, bringing with them an even more ruthless approach to warfare. By spring 1940, nearly 100,000 men served in Waffen SS formations, making it larger than many national armies. The Dutch campaign provided the first test of these reorganized units. The Leibstandard was attached to General Heinz Guderian's 19 Panzer Corps for the breakthrough at Sedan, while other SS formations supported the main assault through the Ardennes forest. From the beginning, it was clear that the winter's training had paid enormous dividends. SS Untersturmführer Michael Wittmann, commanding a reconnaissance platoon in the Leibstandard, later described the opening hours of the campaign. "We crossed the border before dawn, moving faster than I had thought possible. The Dutch had prepared defensive positions, but they were designed to stop World War I-style attacks. Our speed and coordination overwhelmed them completely. By noon, we had advanced 30 kilometers and captured 3 towns. But speed was only part of the story. The Waffen SS had also developed a tactical doctrine that differed significantly from standard Wehrmacht approaches. Where army units relied heavily on artillery preparation and methodical advances, SS formations emphasized aggressive reconnaissance, rapid flanking movements, and the psychological shock of concentrated assault. This tactical innovation was most dramatically demonstrated during the crossing of the Meuse River at Dinant on May 12th. While Wehrmacht engineers prepared pontoon bridges under heavy artillery cover, SS Oberfuhrer Wilhelm Bittrich ordered his men to attempt an immediate assault crossing using rubber boats and whatever cover they could find. The result was spectacular. SS soldiers reached the far bank before French defenders could organize effective resistance, establishing a bridgehead that allowed German armor to cross 12 hours ahead of schedule. But the cost was typical of SS operations. Over 200 casualties in a single afternoon, losses that could have been avoided with more patient tactics. General Erwin Rommel, commanding the 7th Panzer Division nearby, watched the SS crossing with mixed admiration and concern. "They fight with a determination I have rarely seen, but they spend lives like water. Such courage cannot be sustained indefinitely without replacement." Yet for all their tactical recklessness, Waffen SS formations were achieving remarkable results. The Totenkopf division broke through the Maginot Line extension at Avesnes, capturing thousands of French prisoners and opening the way for German armor to reach the Channel coast. The Das Reich division led the advance on Paris, covering 200 miles in just 10 days despite constant combat. More importantly, they were beginning to develop the combined arms expertise that would make them Germany's premier assault formations. SS Panzer crews, many of them recruited from the Hitler Youth, displayed an intuitive understanding of tank warfare that impressed even veteran Wehrmacht officers. Their coordination with infantry, artillery, and air support reached levels of effectiveness that wouldn't be matched by Allied forces for another 2 years. The Siege of Calais provided perhaps the most dramatic example of evolved SS capabilities. British and French forces had established a strong defensive perimeter around the port, hoping to deny the Germans a crucial supply base for any invasion of Britain. The Leibstandard was ordered to reduce the fortress while regular army units continued the advance toward Dunkirk. What followed was a textbook demonstration of modern siege warfare. Instead of attempting costly frontal assaults, SS commanders used their superior mobility to isolate the fortress completely. Reconnaissance units identified weak points in the defensive perimeter, while combat engineers prepared specialized assault equipment. When the final attack came on May 26th, it was a coordinated operation involving armor, infantry, artillery, and close air support. The fortress fell in less than 6 hours, with minimal German casualties. More significantly, the speed of the victory allowed thousands of SS soldiers to be redeployed for the final push toward Dunkirk, contributing to the pressure that forced the British Expeditionary Forces evacuation. But even as they celebrated tactical victories, Waffen SS units were beginning to develop the criminal patterns that would define their wartime reputation. Unlike in Poland, where most atrocities had been committed by specialized Einsatzgruppen, SS combat formations in France were directly responsible for numerous war crimes. The massacre at Le Paradis on May 27th became emblematic of this development. After capturing a British strongpoint defended by men from the Royal Norfolk Regiment, soldiers from the Totenkopf Division herded 99 prisoners into a field and machine-gunned them en masse. Only 2 men survived, hidden beneath the bodies of their comrades, to testify about the atrocity after the war. SS Oberfuhrer Theodor Eicke, commanding the Totenkopf Division, made no attempt to discipline the perpetrators. In his post-action report, he wrote, "British resistance was fanatical and cost us unnecessary casualties. Final elimination of the strongpoint included all enemy personnel to prevent future resistance activities. Such incidents created immediate tensions with Wehrmacht commanders, who were struggling to maintain some semblance of traditional military conduct while implementing Hitler's increasingly radical war aims. But protests from army officers carried less weight than they had in Poland, because the SS was demonstrating undeniable military value. The fall of Paris on June 14th provided a stage for the Waffen SS to display both their military prowess and their ideological commitment. The Leibstandard provided security for Hitler's triumphal tour of the conquered French capital, but they also participated in the systematic looting of Jewish businesses and cultural institutions. SS Untersturmführer Hans Kruger described the scene. "We marched down the Champs-Élysées as conquerors, representatives of the new European order. The French people watched in silence, knowing that their world had changed forever. We were no longer just soldiers. We were the instruments of a racial revolution." By the time France surrendered on June 22nd, the Waffen SS had established itself as an elite combat force capable of independent operations against first-class opponents. Their losses had been significant, over 4,000 casualties in 6 weeks of fighting, but their achievements have been even more impressive. They had outfought British regulars, French colonial troops, and Belgian elite units while maintaining the rapid pace of advance that characterized successful blitzkrieg operations. More ominously, they had also demonstrated that military excellence and criminal behavior could coexist within the same organization. The men who had shown remarkable courage at Dinant and professional competence at Calais were the same soldiers who had murdered prisoners at Le Paradis and participated in the systematic persecution of Jewish civilians. As German forces consolidated their conquest of Western Europe, Waffen SS formations were already being withdrawn for rest, refitting, and expansion. Intelligence reports indicated that Hitler was planning operations against the Soviet Union, a campaign that would dwarf everything that had come before. The lessons of France would prove invaluable in the East, but they would also reveal the true nature of the war that the Waffen SS had been created to fight. What had begun in Poland as racial policy implemented alongside military operations would become, in Russia, a war of extermination where the distinction between soldier and criminal would disappear entirely. The Waffen SS Complete Story, Section 5 Balkan Lightning, Yugoslavia and Greece Campaigns, 1941. The telegram arrived at SS headquarters in Berlin at 3:47 a.m. on March 27, 1941, and its contents sent shockwaves through the Nazi leadership. A military coup in Belgrade had overthrown the Yugoslav government that had just agreed to join the Axis alliance. For Adolf Hitler, this betrayal represented more than a diplomatic setback. It was a direct challenge to German supremacy in the Balkans. Within hours, he had ordered the complete destruction of Yugoslavia, and the Waffen SS would play a crucial role in what would become one of the most brutal campaigns of World War II. But first, they had to deal with an unexpected complication. While Hitler's attention was focused on the Balkans, Benito Mussolini's invasion of Greece had turned into an unmitigated disaster. Italian forces, despite overwhelming numerical superiority, had been routed by Greek defenders and were retreating in chaos across the Albanian mountains. German prestige throughout the region was at stake, and only immediate intervention could salvage the situation. SS Oberfuhrer Felix Steiner, now commanding the reorganized SS Division Das Reich, received his movement orders on April 2nd. His men had barely 6 days to prepare for a campaign that would take them from the snowy mountains of Yugoslavia to the sun-baked hills of the Peloponnese. It would be the Waffen SS' most complex operation yet, a multi-front campaign requiring unprecedented coordination between armored, mountain, and airborne forces. The Yugoslav operation began with a characteristic display of SS aggression and tactical innovation. While Wehrmacht units prepared methodical attacks against prepared defensive positions, Das Reich spearheads launched immediate deep penetration raids designed to paralyze enemy command structures and create panic among defending forces. SS Hauptsturmführer Kurt Meyer, leading an armored reconnaissance battalion, demonstrated the kind of audacious leadership that was becoming synonymous with Waffen SS operations. On April 10th, his unit penetrated 80 kilometers behind Yugoslav lines in a single day, capturing 3 towns and severing the main communication links between Belgrade and the southern armies. Meyer later described the psychological impact. We moved so fast that enemy commanders lost all sense of the tactical situation. Radio intercepts showed complete confusion in their headquarters. They were fighting ghosts, always one step behind, always reacting to our last position instead of our current one. This rapid advance style proved devastatingly effective against the multi-ethnic Yugoslav army, which was already struggling with internal divisions between Serbian officers, Croatian separatists, and communist partisans. SS formations exploited these tensions with sophisticated psychological warfare operations that often caused entire units to surrender without fighting. But the campaign also revealed a darker aspect of SS operations that would have terrible consequences for the civilian population. Unlike previous campaigns in Poland and France, the Balkans were seen by Nazi leadership as a region of fundamental racial conflict, where Germanic peoples were surrounded by supposedly inferior Slavic populations. The Leibstandard SS Adolf Hitler, advancing through Slovenia toward Zagreb, received explicit orders to eliminate potential resistance leaders among the Slovene and Croatian populations. These weren't military targets. They were teachers, priests, journalists, and local political figures who might organize opposition to German occupation. SS Untersturmführer Wilhelm Monk, commanding a company in the Leibstandard, later testified about these operations. We received lists of names from SS intelligence. Our orders were simple: locate these individuals and execute them immediately. No trials, no interrogation, just elimination. We were told this was necessary to prevent partisan warfare. The systematic murder of civilians alongside military operations represented a significant escalation in SS criminality. In Poland and France, most atrocities had been committed by specialized units or in the aftermath of combat. In Yugoslavia, war crimes were integrated into standard operational procedure from the very beginning of the campaign. The conquest of Belgrade on April 13th provided a particularly stark example. While Wehrmacht units accepted the city's surrender according to traditional military protocol, SS formations immediately began implementing what they called pacification measures. These included mass arrests of intellectuals, execution of Serbian Orthodox clergy, and the establishment of concentration points for Jewish and Roma populations. SS Brigadefuhrer Joseph Dietrich, commanding the Leibstandard, justified these actions in his post-campaign report. Belgrade was a center of anti-German sentiment and potential partisan organization. Our rapid elimination of hostile elements prevented months of guerrilla warfare and saved German lives. But the human cost was staggering. Within 48 hours of Belgrade's capture, over 2,000 civilians had been murdered by SS units. Synagogues were burned, libraries destroyed, and entire neighborhoods evacuated for security reasons. The systematic nature of these crimes indicated careful preparation and high-level authorization. The Greek phase of the campaign presented different challenges, but revealed the same criminal tendencies. British and Australian forces, fighting alongside Greek defenders, had established strong defensive positions in the mountain passes leading south from Yugoslavia. These positions could only be overcome through careful coordination between ground forces, air power, and specialized mountain troops. The SS division Adolf Hitler proved particularly effective in this terrain. Many of their soldiers came from Austria and Bavaria, regions where mountain warfare skills were part of local culture. They adapted quickly to fighting at high altitude, using techniques learned from German mountain warfare specialists combined with SS tactical innovations. The breakthrough at the Monastir Gap on April 15th demonstrated this adaptation perfectly. While British defenders expected a frontal assault through the main pass, SS reconnaissance units identified a supposedly impassable route through the mountains to the east. A reinforced battalion spent 3 days climbing through snow-covered peaks, carrying their weapons and ammunition by hand, to establish positions behind British lines. When the main attack began on April 18th, British forces found themselves under fire from 3 directions simultaneously. The position, which might have held for weeks against conventional attacks, collapsed in less than 6 hours. Over 3,000 British and Australian soldiers were captured, along with most of their heavy equipment. But even this tactical masterpiece was marred by criminal conduct. SS soldiers systematically murdered Greek civilians suspected of providing information to British forces. Entire villages were burned, their inhabitants executed or deported. The distinction between combatants and non-combatants, already blurred in Yugoslavia, disappeared entirely in the Greek mountains. The campaign's final phase took SS units through some of the most famous battlefields in European history. The Leibstandarte fought at Thermopylae, where Spartan warriors had held off Persian invaders 2,400 years earlier. Das Reich crossed the plains where Alexander the Great had trained his armies for the conquest of Asia. The historical irony was not lost on SS commanders, who saw themselves as continuing a Germanic tradition of conquest in southeastern Europe. Athens fell on April 27th, and the Wehrmacht's victory parade through the ancient city included prominent SS formations. But behind the pageantry, SS units were already implementing occupation policies that would devastate Greek society. Mass executions, deportations, and systematic looting created conditions that would fuel one of Europe's most vicious resistance movements. The Balkan campaign had lasted just 24 days, but its impact on Waffen SS development was profound. For the first time, SS formations had operated independently over extended distances, coordinating complex multi-unit operations across difficult terrain. They had demonstrated tactical flexibility and professional competence that impressed even their Wehrmacht rivals. More ominously, they had also shown that military excellence could coexist with systematic criminality. The same units that had executed brilliant flanking maneuvers and breakthrough operations had also murdered thousands of civilians and implemented racial policies that violated every principle of civilized warfare. The casualty statistics told part of the story. SS formations had suffered less than 2,000 combat casualties while inflicting devastating losses on enemy forces. But they had also killed an estimated 15,000 civilians and created conditions that would lead to years of brutal guerrilla warfare. As SS units pulled back to Germany for rest and refitting in May 1941, their commanders already knew that an even larger operation was being planned. Intelligence reports indicated massive troop concentrations along the Soviet border, and veteran SS officers understood that everything they had experienced so far, Poland, France, the Balkans, had been merely preparation for the real war. Operation Barbarossa would test not only their military capabilities, but their capacity to function as soldiers in a campaign that Hitler had explicitly defined as a war of racial extermination. The lessons learned in Yugoslavia and Greece would prove invaluable in the East, but they would also contribute to crimes that would dwarf everything that had come before. The Waffen SS Complete Story. Section 6 Barbarossa Unleashed. The Eastern Front begins June 1941. At 3:15 a.m. on June 22, 1941, along a front stretching from the Baltic Sea to the Black Sea, over 3 million German soldiers prepared for the largest military operation in human history. In the pre-dawn darkness near Brest-Litovsk, SS Oberfuhrer Paul Hauser checked his watch one final time and whispered into his radio, "All units, this is Barbarossa. Execute, execute, execute." Operation Barbarossa, the invasion of the Soviet Union, had begun, and with it, the Waffen SS would enter a conflict that would transform them from elite soldiers into the instruments of genocide. But this wasn't just another military campaign. Hitler had made it clear to his generals that the war in the East would be fundamentally different from anything fought in Western Europe. This would be a Vernichtungskrieg, a war of annihilation designed not merely to defeat the Soviet Union, but to destroy it completely as a political, cultural, and racial entity. The Waffen SS, with their unique combination of military capability and ideological commitment, were perfectly suited for this new kind of warfare. The SS formations that crossed the Soviet border that morning represented the largest and most powerful force Himmler had ever assembled. The Leibstandarte SS Adolf Hitler, now expanded to division strength, spearheaded Army Group South's advance toward Kiev. SS Division Das Reich led the central thrust toward Moscow as part of Army Group Center. SS Division Totenkopf supported Army Group North's drive on Leningrad. For the first time in military history, an entire Army Corps worth of SS troops was committed to a single campaign. The initial results exceeded even Hitler's optimistic expectations. Soviet forces, caught completely by surprise despite numerous intelligence warnings, collapsed along the entire front. Within hours of the invasion start, SS formations were advancing at speeds that made their previous campaigns look cautious by comparison. SS Hauptsturmführer Joachim Paper, commanding a reinforced battalion in the Leibstandarte, later described the opening phase. "It was like a dam bursting. We had trained for this moment for 2 years, studying every detail of Soviet organization and tactics. When we finally attacked, their entire defensive system simply disintegrated. We advanced 60 kilometers in the first day alone. The speed of the advance was matched by its savagery. Unlike previous campaigns, where SS units had to balance military objectives with occupation duties, Barbarossa authorized them to implement racial policies immediately and without restraint. The infamous Commissar order directed all German forces to execute captured Soviet political officers, while the Barbarossa decree suspended normal rules of warfare for the entire Eastern campaign. SS formations embraced these orders with enthusiasm that shocked even veteran Wehrmacht officers. The Totenkopf Division, advancing through the Baltic states, murdered over 1,000 civilians in their first week of operations. These weren't combat casualties or unfortunate accidents. They were systematic executions of Jews, communist officials, and intellectuals carried out according to prepared lists. SS Brigadefuhrer Theodor Eich, commanding Totenkopf, justified these actions in terms that revealed how completely SS thinking had been militarized. "We are not fighting a conventional war against a civilized opponent." The Bolshevik Jewish system represents an existential threat to European civilization. Every political commissar eliminated, every Jewish intellectual executed, advances our ultimate victory. But the criminal conduct didn't diminish SS military performance. If anything, it seemed to enhance it. Freed from any restraint on their actions, SS formations fought with a ferocity that terrified Soviet defenders and impressed German allies. The psychological impact was enormous. Word spread through Red Army units that capture by SS troops meant certain death, causing many Soviet soldiers to fight with desperate determination, while others surrendered to Wehrmacht units rather than face SS captivity. The encirclement battles of the campaign's first months showcased SS tactical evolution at its finest. At Minsk in late June, the Leibstandard executed a textbook double envelopment that trapped over 300,000 Soviet soldiers. At Smolensk in July, Das Reich demonstrated innovative use of combined arms that allowed them to break through prepared defensive positions that had held up regular army units for days. These victories were achieved through tactical methods that had been perfected during 2 years of intensive training. SS formations had developed a doctrine of aggressive reconnaissance followed by concentrated assault at identified weak points. Their superior communications equipment allowed unprecedented coordination between armor, infantry, and air support. Most importantly, their ideological motivation made them willing to accept casualty rates that other units would have considered prohibitive. SS Untersturmführer Michael Wittmann, now commanding a Tiger tank in the Leibstandard, exemplified this new generation of SS warriors. In a single engagement near Zhytomyr on July 13th, Wittmann's tank destroyed 7 Soviet T-34s and 2 anti-tank guns, allowing his battalion to break through positions that had stopped an entire Wehrmacht regiment. Wittmann's after-action report revealed the psychology that made such achievements possible. We knew that every day we delayed our advance meant more time for the enemy to organize resistance. German soldiers were dying while we hesitated. The racial struggle demanded immediate, decisive action regardless of personal cost. But the campaign's early successes were masking serious problems that would eventually cripple German offensive capabilities. SS casualty rates, always high due to their aggressive tactics, were reaching unsustainable levels. The Totenkopf division lost over 40 of its original strength in the first 3 months of fighting. Das Reich and the Leibstandard suffered similar losses, forcing emergency recruitment drives that diluted the careful selection standards that had originally defined SS formations. More seriously, the criminal conduct that characterized SS operations was creating strategic complications that German leadership had not anticipated. Mass executions and systematic brutality were driving civilian populations into the arms of partisan movements that were beginning to threaten German supply lines. Soviet resistance, rather than collapsing as Hitler had predicted, was stiffening as word spread about German treatment of prisoners and civilians. The siege of Leningrad provided a particularly stark example of how military objectives and criminal policies could conflict. The Totenkopf division was assigned to complete the encirclement of the city, cutting off all supply routes and forcing surrender through starvation. This was a legitimate military operation that could have shortened the war by months. But SS units couldn't resist implementing racial policies even during active combat operations. Instead of simply establishing defensive positions, they began systematically murdering civilians in the suburban areas they controlled. These actions required significant manpower and resources that could have been used for military purposes, while generating intelligence for Soviet defenders about German intentions. SS Oberfuhrer George Kepler, commanding an SS regiment outside Leningrad, later admitted the contradiction. We were supposed to be elite soldiers focused on military victory, but we were constantly diverted to implement security measures that had nothing to do with defeating enemy forces. It was impossible to maintain tactical focus when every village required racial screening. The approach of winter brought new challenges that exposed fundamental weaknesses in SS organization and equipment. Despite their elite status, SS formations had not been provided with adequate winter clothing or specialized equipment for cold weather operations. Their vehicles, designed for rapid movement across Western European roads, were poorly suited to Russian conditions. More importantly, the ideological training that had made SS soldiers so effective in the campaign's early phases began to work against them as conditions deteriorated. Their belief in German racial superiority made it difficult to acknowledge tactical failures or adapt to changing circumstances. Rather than developing new methods suited to winter warfare, SS commanders often responded to setbacks by demanding greater aggression and fanatical resistance. The failed assault on Moscow in December 1941 marked the end of the Waffen SS period of unqualified success. For the first time since their formation, SS units were forced to retreat under enemy pressure. The psychological impact was devastating for soldiers who had been taught that German racial superiority guaranteed victory in any conflict. SS Hauptsturmführer Fritz Witt, commanding a battalion in the Leibstandard during the Moscow withdrawal, described the crisis. Everything we had believed about the racial struggle was being tested. We had been told that Slavic peoples were incapable of organized resistance. Yet here they were pushing us back with tactics we hadn't expected and equipment we hadn't seen before. By the end of 1941, the Waffen SS had suffered over 60,000 casualties on the Eastern Front, nearly half their total strength at the campaign's beginning. But they had also established themselves as Germany's premier assault formations, capable of achieving victories that regular Wehrmacht units couldn't match. More ominously, they had proven that military excellence and criminal conduct could not only coexist, but actually reinforce each other under the right circumstances. The failure to achieve quick victory meant that the war in the East would continue for years, not months. This reality would force fundamental changes in SS organization, recruitment, and tactics. But it would also provide unlimited opportunities to implement the racial policies that had always been their ultimate mission. What happened next would determine whether the Waffen SS would be remembered primarily as elite soldiers or as the military arm of genocide. The Waffen SS complete story. Section 7 elite divisions emerge: Das Reich, Totenkopf, and Leibstandard, 1941 to 1942. The winter wind howled across the frozen steppes of Ukraine as SS Führer Paul Hauser surveyed the devastation around Kharkov. It was February 1943, and the city had changed hands 4 times in 6 months, each battle more savage than the last. Hauser's 2 SS Panzer Corps, comprising the Leibstandard, Das Reich, and Totenkopf divisions, had just completed one of the most remarkable military operations of World War II, recapturing Kharkov against overwhelming odds and proving that the Waffen SS had evolved into something unprecedented in military history. But the road to this moment had been paved with blood, brilliance, and brutality in equal measure. The transformation of these 3 formations from experimental units into Germany's most feared combat divisions represented not just tactical evolution, but a fundamental change in the nature of warfare itself. They had become something that no military academy had ever taught: elite soldiers who were simultaneously instruments of genocide, capable of battlefield miracles and unconscionable crimes within the same operational cycle. The metamorphosis began during the desperate winter months of 1941 to 42, when the failure of Operation Barbarossa forced German leadership to confront the reality of prolonged warfare on the Eastern Front. Hitler's vision of quick victory through racial superiority had collapsed in the snows outside Moscow, and the Waffen SS divisions found themselves fighting for survival rather than conquest. SS Brigadefuhrer Joseph Sepp Dietrich, commanding the Leibstandard during the brutal retreat from Moscow, later described the psychological transformation. We learned that ideology alone wouldn't stop a T-34 tank or keep you warm at minus 40 degrees. We had to become real soldiers, not just believers, but professionals who could adapt, improvise, and survive against any opponent. This professional evolution was most dramatically demonstrated during the Rusev salient operations of early 1942. Soviet forces had established a dangerous bulge in German lines that threatened to break through to Smolensk and beyond. The 3 elite SS divisions were hastily redeployed from other sectors to contain what could have become a catastrophic breakthrough. The Totenkopf division, under SS Oberfuhrer Theodor Eich, exemplified this new tactical sophistication. Instead of the frontal assaults that had characterized earlier SS operations, Eich's men used sophisticated defensive tactics that maximized the effectiveness of their limited resources. They established multiple defensive lines, used mobile reserves to counterattack Soviet penetrations, and coordinated closely with Luftwaffe ground attack aircraft. The results were remarkable. Despite being outnumbered 3-1, Totenkopf not only held their assigned sector, but actually expanded it, pushing Soviet forces back across the Volga River. Their success came at a terrible cost, over 4,000 casualties in 6 weeks, but it demonstrated that SS formations could excel at defensive operations as well as offensive ones. Das Reich's performance during the same period revealed another aspect of SS tactical evolution. SS Oberfuhrer George Kepler had transformed his division into a combined arms force that could shift seamlessly between defensive and offensive operations. When Soviet forces broke through adjacent Wehrmacht positions, Das Reich executed a textbook mobile defense that not only contained a breakthrough, but turned it into a devastating counterattack. SS Hauptsturmführer Sylvester Stadler, commanding a panzer battalion in Das Reich, later explained the tactical innovation. We had learned to think of the battlefield as a three-dimensional chess game. Every unit movement had to support multiple objectives: current defense, future offense, and protection of our flanks. It required a level of coordination that took years to develop. But perhaps the most significant development was the emergence of a distinctly SS approach to combined arms warfare. Traditional German doctrine emphasized centralized planning and methodical execution. SS formations, by contrast, developed a system based on decentralized initiative within clearly defined operational frameworks. The Leibstandard's operations around Izium in May 1942 provided the perfect example. When Soviet forces launched a major offensive designed to recapture the strategic city, SS Oberfuhrer Fritz Witt didn't wait for higher headquarters to issue detailed orders. Instead, he authorized his subordinate commanders to respond immediately to tactical opportunities as they developed. The result was a fluid battle in which SS battle groups shifted constantly between defensive and offensive roles, often operating independently for days at a time, while maintaining overall coordination through superior radio communications. Soviet commanders, accustomed to fighting more predictable Wehrmacht formations, found themselves consistently outmaneuvered by opponents who seemed to anticipate their every move. This tactical flexibility was enhanced by equipment advantages that reflected the SS privileged position within the German military hierarchy. While regular army units struggled with obsolete weapons and limited supplies, SS divisions received priority allocation of the most advanced German equipment. The introduction of the Panzer IV F2, with its long-barreled 75mm gun, gave SS tank crews a significant advantage over Soviet T-34s. The new MG-42 machine gun provided infantry with unprecedented firepower. Most importantly, SS formations were the first to receive the sophisticated radio equipment that made their decentralized tactics possible. SS Untersturmführer Michael Wittmann, now commanding a company of the new tanks, demonstrated their effectiveness during a single engagement near Villers-Bocage. In less than 15 minutes, his 5 tanks destroyed an entire British armored column, knocking out 25 vehicles without suffering a single loss. Such achievements were becoming routine for SS tank crews, establishing a psychological dominance that extended far beyond mere tactical success. But the elite status of these divisions came with a dark price that grew heavier with each passing month. Their privileged position within the SS hierarchy meant they were regularly assigned to implement the most extreme aspects of Nazi racial policy. Unlike regular Wehrmacht units, which could sometimes avoid participation in genocide, SS divisions were expected to combine military operations with systematic murder. The anti-partisan operations conducted by Das Reich during the summer of 1942 illustrated this terrible duality. On paper, these were legitimate military operations designed to protect German supply lines from guerrilla attacks. In practice, they became opportunities for mass murder on an unprecedented scale. SS Sturmbannführer Adolf Diekmann, commanding a battalion in Das Reich, received orders to eliminate partisan activity in the Oradour-sur-Glane region of occupied France. His response was to surround the entire village, herd all 642 inhabitants into the church and local school, then burn both buildings with the people inside. The operation was completed in less than 4 hours, and no German casualties were reported. Dieckmann justified the massacre in his operational report. Intelligence indicated extensive partisan support throughout the civilian population. Complete elimination of the village was necessary to prevent future resistance activities and demonstrate the consequences of supporting enemy forces. Such incidents were becoming commonplace across all three elite divisions, creating a military culture in which extraordinary battlefield courage coexisted with systematic criminality. The same men who displayed remarkable heroism in combat against armed opponents showed no hesitation in murdering defenseless civilians when ordered to do so. The psychological mechanisms that made this possible were complex and disturbing. Years of ideological indoctrination had convinced many SS soldiers that they were fighting an existential racial war in which normal moral constraints didn't apply. Combat stress and constant exposure to violence had desensitized them to suffering. Most importantly, the tight-knit unit cohesion that made them so effective in battle also created social pressure to conform to criminal orders. SS Ratenführer Hans Schmidt, a veteran of both Stalingrad and the Warsaw Ghetto Uprising, later attempted to explain this mindset. We lived in a world where death was constant and meaningless. Whether it was a Russian tank crew or a Jewish family made no difference. They were all enemies of the Reich. The only thing that mattered was the mission and your comrades beside you. By the end of 1942, the three elite SS divisions had established themselves as Germany's most capable military formations. Their tactical innovations were being studied and copied by Wehrmacht units throughout the German military. Their battlefield achievements had earned grudging respect from Allied commanders who faced them in combat. But they had also become something that had never existed before in European warfare: elite military units that were simultaneously instruments of systematic genocide. Their military excellence provided cover for their criminal activities, while their ideological commitment enhanced their battlefield effectiveness. The statistical record told part of the story. In 18 months of Eastern Front operations, the three divisions had inflicted over 500,000 casualties on Soviet forces, while suffering only 45,000 themselves, a kill ratio that exceeded anything achieved by comparable Wehrmacht formations. But they had also participated in the murder of approximately 100,000 civilians and prisoners of war, crimes that would have been impossible without their unique combination of military capability and criminal purpose. As 1943 began, these formations stood at the peak of their military effectiveness. But they also faced challenges that would test their capacity to maintain elite status in an increasingly desperate strategic situation. The disaster at Stalingrad had cost Germany her entire Sixth Army, and Soviet forces were beginning to demonstrate tactical sophistication that matched their numerical advantages. The coming battle for Kharkov would determine whether the Waffen SS elite divisions could maintain their battlefield dominance under conditions of strategic disadvantage. More ominously, it would also determine whether military excellence could ultimately overcome the moral corruption that had become inseparable from their identity. Foreign volunteers. Europeans joined the ranks, 1940 to 1943. The young Norwegian stepped off the train at the SS training camp in Senheim, Alsace, his breath visible in the cold December air of 1940. Jonas Lai Jr., son of Norway's most prominent Nazi collaborator, had volunteered to join what Heinrich Himmler was calling the European crusade against Bolshevism. But as he looked around at the diverse group of volunteers, Dutchmen, Flemish Belgians, Danish farmers, and French fascists, he realized he was witnessing something unprecedented in military history. The creation of a truly international army united not by nationality, but by racial ideology and hatred of communism. What Lai couldn't have known was that his decision to join the Waffen SS would help transform Himmler's organization from a German institution into a pan-European movement that would eventually include nearly 350,000 foreign volunteers from over 20 nations. This expansion would test every assumption about nationality, loyalty, and military effectiveness, while creating combat formations that were simultaneously among the most multinational and most ideologically committed units ever assembled. The recruitment of foreign volunteers began almost accidentally in the aftermath of Germany's conquests in Western Europe. As SS administrators processed thousands of prisoners of war from defeated armies, they discovered significant numbers of men who were sympathetic to National Socialism and eager to continue fighting against what they saw as the common enemies of European civilization: communism, Judaism, and Anglo-American capitalism. SS Oberfuhrer Felix Steiner, who had emerged as one of the Waffen SS most innovative commanders, immediately recognized the potential. In a memo to Himmler dated August 15, 1940, he wrote, "We have identified over 2,000 prisoners who possess both military experience and ideological commitment suitable for SS service. These men could form the nucleus of formations that would demonstrate the pan-European nature of our struggle." Himmler needed little convincing. His vision of the SS as the racial elite of a greater Germanic Reich had always transcended national boundaries. The opportunity to recruit racially valuable Europeans fitted perfectly with his long-term plans for SS expansion. More immediately, foreign volunteers could help replace the heavy casualties suffered by German SS formations during the campaigns in Poland and France. The first foreign SS unit was the SS Standard Nordland, formed in February 1941 from Norwegian and Danish volunteers. These men were considered ideal recruits. They came from nations that Nazi racial theory classified as purely Germanic. They possessed strong anti-communist credentials, and many had previous military experience in their national armies. The training program developed for these foreign volunteers revealed both the possibilities and limitations of SS international expansion. Language barriers created immediate problems, as most Scandinavian volunteers spoke little or no German. Cultural differences proved even more challenging, as men raised in democratic traditions struggled to adapt to the absolute obedience demanded by SS discipline. SS Hauptsturmführer Christian Teixen, assigned as a training officer for the Nordland Regiment, later described the cultural clash. These were good soldiers with strong motivation, but they had been raised to think for themselves and question authority. We had to break down their democratic habits and rebuild them as National Socialist warriors. It was like creating new men from scratch. The process was often brutal. Foreign volunteers were subjected to the same ideological indoctrination as German SS recruits, but with additional emphasis on their role as representatives of a pan-European racial struggle. They studied maps showing the racial composition of Eastern Europe, learned to identify valuable Germanic populations for resettlement, and received detailed instruction on the Jewish Bolshevik conspiracy that supposedly threatened European civilization. But the training also produced remarkable results. By the spring of 1941, the Nordland Regiment had achieved combat readiness comparable to German SS formations. More importantly, these foreign volunteers displayed a level of ideological commitment that sometimes exceeded that of their German comrades. The invasion of the Soviet Union provided the first real test of foreign SS capabilities. The Nordland Regiment was assigned to Army Group North for the advance on Leningrad, while other foreign formations supported operations in different sectors of the Eastern Front. From the beginning, it was clear that these units possessed unique advantages and disadvantages compared to regular SS formations. On the positive side, foreign volunteers often displayed exceptional motivation in combat against Soviet forces. Many came from countries that had experienced communist revolutions or Soviet occupation, giving them personal reasons to fight that went beyond abstract ideology. Norwegian volunteers remembered the German invasion of their homeland as liberation from British occupation. Danish volunteers saw themselves as defending Nordic civilization against Slavic barbarism. SS Unterscharfer Erik Hansen, a Danish farmer who had joined Nordland after his village was bombed by the RAF, exemplified this motivation. "I wasn't fighting for Germany. I was fighting for Europe, for our race, for everything that made our civilization superior to the communist East. Every Russian we killed was one less threat to our children's future." But foreign formations also revealed significant weaknesses that would plague international SS recruitment throughout the war. Language barriers made coordination difficult, especially during complex operations requiring precise timing. Cultural differences created friction between foreign volunteers and German officers, many of whom considered non-Germans inherently inferior regardless of their racial classification. Most seriously, foreign volunteers often lacked the deep institutional loyalty that bound German SS men to their organization. When casualties mounted and victory seemed distant, foreign formations experienced desertion rates significantly higher than German units. Many volunteers had joined expecting a short, victorious campaign against communism, not a prolonged war of attrition. The expansion of foreign recruitment accelerated dramatically after the initial success of Operation Barbarossa. As German forces advanced deep into Soviet territory, Himmler authorized the creation of new international formations from an increasingly diverse range of European nations. The SS Division Viking, formed in December 1940, included volunteers from Germany, Norway, Denmark, the Netherlands, Belgium, Finland, and even some Baltic Germans from occupied territories. This diversity created unprecedented command challenges. The division's commander, SS Oberfuhrer Felix Steiner, had to coordinate operations using officers who spoke 6 different languages and commanded troops with radically different military traditions. Radio communications required multiple interpreters, and written orders had to be translated into several languages before distribution. Yet despite these obstacles, Viking became one of the most effective SS formations on the Eastern Front. The division's combination of German tactical expertise and foreign motivation proved devastatingly effective against Soviet defenders. In the advance toward the Caucasus oil fields during the summer of 1942, Viking consistently outperformed regular Wehrmacht divisions operating in the same sector. The secret to their success lay in what SS commanders called motivated diversity. Each national contingent brought unique strengths to the division's overall capabilities. Norwegian volunteers, raised in a culture that valued individual initiative, excelled as reconnaissance troops and snipers. Dutch volunteers, many of whom had engineering backgrounds, became expert at bridging operations and fortification construction. Finnish volunteers, with their experience from the Winter War, proved invaluable for winter operations and anti-partisan activities. But the expansion of foreign recruitment also revealed the fundamental contradictions in Nazi racial ideology. As casualties mounted and the need for manpower became desperate, SS recruiters began accepting volunteers from nations that didn't fit neatly into Germanic racial categories. French volunteers formed the SS Sturmbrigade Frankreich, despite Nazi ideology classifying most Frenchmen as racially inferior. Belgian Walloons, who spoke French rather than Germanic languages, were organized into the SS Sturmbrigade Wallonien under the command of the charismatic fascist leader Léon Degrelle. Degreille's unit provided perhaps the most dramatic example of how ideology could overcome racial classifications. Despite being considered non-Germanic by Nazi standards, the Walloon volunteers fought with exceptional valor on the Eastern Front. Degrelle himself earned the Knight's Cross for his leadership during desperate defensive battles around Cherkasy, becoming one of the most decorated foreign commanders in SS service. The success of non-Germanic formations forced Himmler to develop new racial theories that could accommodate military reality. The concept of European solidarity against Bolshevism gradually replaced strict Germanic racial requirements as the primary criterion for SS service. This ideological flexibility allowed the recruitment of volunteers from increasingly unlikely sources. The SS Legion Nederland, formed from Dutch volunteers in 1941, demonstrated both the possibilities and problems of this expansion. Dutch society was considered racially Germanic by Nazi ideology, and many volunteers possessed strong anti-communist credentials developed during the economic upheavals of the 1930s. But Dutch political culture emphasized consensus and negotiation rather than absolute obedience, creating constant friction with SS command expectations. SS Brigadefuhrer Jürgen Wagner, who commanded several foreign SS formations, later reflected on these challenges. We were trying to create a unified military force for men who had been raised in fundamentally different political systems. German volunteers understood hierarchical authority because they had grown up with it. Foreign volunteers often had to learn obedience as adults, which created tensions that never fully disappeared. By the end of 1942, foreign volunteers comprised nearly 25% of total Waffen SS strength, approximately 200,000 men from over 15 European nations. These formations had proven their military value in campaigns from the Arctic Circle to the Caucasus Mountains. They had also demonstrated that Nazi ideology could transcend national boundaries when combined with effective propaganda and shared enemies. But foreign SS expansion also created problems that would plague the organization for the remainder of the war. Competition between national contingents undermined unit cohesion. Language barriers complicated command and control. Most seriously, the political commitments that motivated foreign volunteers often conflicted with German strategic objectives, creating tensions that would explode into open rebellion in the war's final phases. As 1943 began, foreign volunteers stood at a crossroads that would define their wartime experience. The disaster at Stalingrad had demonstrated that Germany might not achieve the quick victory that had motivated their initial enlistment. Soviet offensives were pushing German forces back across Eastern Europe, threatening the homelands that many foreign volunteers had joined the SS to protect. The test of their commitment was coming, and with it, the test of whether ideology alone could sustain military effectiveness when national interests began to diverge from German war aims. The Waffen SS Complete Story. Section 9 Stalingrad Shadow. The Waffen SS in Urban Hell. 1942 to 1943. The sniper's bullet caught SS Unterscharfer Heinrich Müller in the throat as he peered around the corner of what had once been a children's school. It was November 15, 1942, and Müller's squad had been fighting for the same block in Stalingrad's factory district for 8 days, gaining perhaps 50 meters at the cost of half their strength. As his comrades dragged him back through the rubble, Müller's blood mixed with the dust of pulverized concrete and the ashes of a city that had become the graveyard of armies. What Müller couldn't know as consciousness faded was that his sacrifice was part of the largest urban battle in human history, a 6-month struggle that would consume entire armies and transform the nature of warfare itself. For the Waffen SS, Stalingrad would prove both their tactical brilliance and their strategic limitations, demonstrating that even the most elite formations could be ground to pieces in the machinery of industrial warfare. The SS involvement in Stalingrad began almost by accident. When Hitler ordered the German Sixth Army to capture the city in August 1942, no Waffen SS formations were initially assigned to the operation. The 3 elite divisions, Leibstandard, Das Reich, and Totenkopf, were committed to other sectors of the Eastern Front, pursuing objectives that German leadership considered more important than the symbolic value of Stalin's namesake city. But as resistance stiffened and Wehrmacht units became bogged down in brutal street fighting, German commanders began requesting SS reinforcements with increasing urgency. General Friedrich Paulus, commanding the Sixth Army, sent a desperate message to Army Group Headquarters on September 23rd. Progress has slowed to meters per day. Request immediate deployment of elite formations capable of breakthrough operations in urban terrain. Hitler's response was to authorize the deployment of SS battle groups drawn for formations operating in other sectors. These weren't complete divisions, but carefully selected units with specialized training and equipment suited to urban warfare. What they found when they reached Stalingrad was unlike anything in their previous experience. The city had been transformed into a landscape that seemed designed by madmen. Months of bombing and artillery fire had reduced most buildings to skeletal frameworks filled with rubble. Streets became canyons of broken masonry where snipers could remain hidden for days. Underground tunnel systems, originally built for utility maintenance, had become subterranean highways that allowed defenders to appear and disappear like ghosts. SS Hauptsturmführer Otto Skorzeny, leading a specialist combat engineer unit, later described his first impressions. This wasn't warfare as we had learned it. It was mining, archaeology, and murder combined into something that had no name. Every basement might contain a machine gun nest. Every pile of rubble could hide a tank. We were fighting an enemy who had become part of the city itself. The tactical innovations required for urban combat played to many traditional SS strengths while exposing critical weaknesses. Their emphasis on individual initiative and small unit tactics proved invaluable in situations where conventional command and control broke down completely. SS soldiers adapted quickly to fighting in squad-sized groups, often operating independently for days while maintaining overall coordination through primitive radio networks. The legendary SS-Scharfer Michael Wittmann, temporarily reassigned from tank warfare to infantry operations, demonstrated this adaptability during the battle for the Red October Steelworks, leading a mixed group of SS soldiers and Wehrmacht engineers. Wittmann developed innovative mouse-holing techniques that allowed German forces to advance through buildings without exposing themselves to sniper fire. His method involved using shaped charges to blast holes through interior walls, creating covered routes through entire city blocks. Small assault groups could advance from basement to basement, emerging only when they reached advantageous positions for attacking Soviet strongpoints. The technique was so effective that it was quickly adopted by other units and became standard procedure for urban warfare. But the intensity of close-quarters combat also revealed disturbing aspects of SS psychology that had been less apparent in mobile warfare. The constant stress of urban fighting, combined with heavy casualties and the dehumanizing environment of a destroyed city, accelerated the breakdown of normal moral constraints that had already been weakened by ideological indoctrination. SS formations in Stalingrad developed a reputation for exceptional brutality even by Eastern Front standards. Captured Soviet soldiers were routinely executed rather than evacuated to prisoner of war camps. Wounded enemies were shot where they lay. Most disturbingly, civilian survivors found in basements and ruins were often killed on suspicion of providing intelligence to Soviet forces. SS Sturmbannführer Joseph Kramer, commanding a battalion in the factory district, justified these practices in his war diary. The civilian population has been completely militarized by Bolshevik propaganda. Every babushka is a potential spy, every child a potential saboteur. Our survival depends on treating all inhabitants as combatants until proven otherwise. Such attitudes reflected not just combat stress, but the logical extension of SS racial ideology to urban warfare conditions. Years of indoctrination had taught SS soldiers that they were fighting an existential struggle against racially inferior opponents who didn't deserve the protections normally accorded to enemy combatants. The hellish environment of Stalingrad seemed to validate their most extreme beliefs about the nature of warfare in the East. The battle's intensity also pushed SS tactical innovation to its limits. Traditional German emphasis on rapid movement and breakthrough operations was impossible in an environment where progress was measured in rooms rather than kilometers. SS formations had to develop entirely new approaches to warfare that emphasized patience, stealth, and methodical reduction of enemy positions. The assault on the grain elevator, a massive concrete structure that Soviet forces had converted into a fortress, exemplified this tactical evolution. SS Oberfuhrer Werner Ostendorf, coordinating the attack, rejected conventional approaches that would have relied on massive artillery preparation followed by frontal assault. Instead, he developed a complex operation that combined underground infiltration, precision demolitions, and psychological warfare. The operation began with combat engineers tunneling beneath the building over a period of 3 weeks, placing explosive charges in the foundation while avoiding detection by Soviet defenders. Simultaneously, sniper teams eliminated Soviet observation posts one by one, reducing the defenders' situational awareness. When a main assault finally began, it was a coordinated attack from above, below, and within that overwhelmed the garrison in less than 2 hours. Such tactical masterpieces demonstrated that SS formations could adapt their traditional aggressive style to the unique requirements of urban combat. But they also revealed the enormous cost of achieving tactical success in an environment that favor defenders. The capture of the grain elevator cost SS units over 300 casualties, a price that would have been unacceptable for a similar objective in mobile warfare. As autumn turned to winter, the strategic situation around Stalingrad began to deteriorate rapidly. Soviet forces had completed a massive buildup on the flanks of the German advance, preparing the counteroffensive that would eventually encircle the entire Sixth Army. But German commanders, mesmerized by the tactical battles raging within the city, failed to recognize the growing threat to their flanks. SS units played a crucial role in this strategic blindness. Their consistent tactical successes created an illusion of progress that masked the fundamental impossibility of their mission. Every captured block, every eliminated Soviet strongpoint, every minor tactical victory reinforced German confidence that the city would eventually fall to superior tactics and determination. SS Brigadeführer Fritz Kramer, serving as a liaison between SS formations and Army Group headquarters, later reflected on this dangerous optimism. We were winning every battle and losing the war, but we couldn't see it at the time. Our soldiers were performing miracles on a daily basis, capturing positions that should have been impregnable. How could we imagine that tactical brilliance might not be enough? The Soviet counteroffensive, launched on November 19, 1942, shattered these illusions within hours. Operation Uranus struck the Romanian and Italian forces protecting German flanks, achieving breakthrough that threatened to encircle all German forces in and around Stalingrad. SS units, committed to attacking within the city, were unable to redeploy quickly enough to meet the new threat. For the first time in their history, SS formations found themselves fighting from desperate defensive positions against an enemy who possessed clear tactical and strategic advantages. The psychological impact was devastating for soldiers who had been conditioned to see themselves as racially superior warriors destined for victory. The encirclement of the Sixth Army marked the beginning of a 4-month siege that would test SS endurance and loyalty to their breaking point. Trapped within an ever-shrinking perimeter, SS units faced not only enemy fire but starvation, disease, and the knowledge that their tactical excellence had led them into a strategic trap from which there might be no escape. What happened next would determine whether the Waffen SS could maintain their elite identity under conditions of desperation and defeat that they had never previously experienced. The Waffen SS Complete Story, Section 10 Kursk, the last great offensive, summer 1943. The pre-dawn silence over the Kursk salient was broken by the distinctive rumble of Tiger tank engines warming up in the July heat. SS Oberfuhrer Hermann Priest adjusted his headset and spoke quietly into his radio. All units, this is Citadel. In 10 minutes, we begin the largest tank battle in history. It was 4:30 a.m. on July 5th, 1943, and Operation Citadel, Germany's last great offensive on the Eastern Front, was about to test whether the Waffen SS could achieve one final decisive victory against increasingly sophisticated Soviet defenses. What Priest couldn't know as his 2 SS Panzer Corps prepared to attack was that this battle would mark the end of German offensive capability on the Eastern Front and the beginning of an irreversible strategic retreat. For the Waffen SS, Kursk would represent both their tactical peak and their strategic failure, a demonstration that even elite formations with the best equipment and training could not overcome the mathematics of industrial warfare. The decision to launch Operation Citadel had been controversial from the beginning. After the disaster at Stalingrad, many German generals argued for a defensive strategy that would allow the Wehrmacht to rebuild its strength while forcing the Soviets to attack prepared positions. But Hitler was convinced that only another decisive offensive could restore German initiative on the Eastern Front and convince Germany's increasingly nervous allies that the war could still be won. The Kursk salient provided an apparently perfect target for this offensive. Soviet forces had advanced deep into German lines during their winter offensives, creating a bulge that could be attacked from 3 sides simultaneously. German intelligence estimated that eliminating the salient would destroy 2 entire Soviet army groups, over 600,000 men and thousands of tanks and guns. For this crucial operation, Hitler assembled the largest concentration of elite formations in German military history. The southern pincer of the attack would be spearheaded by the two SS Panzer Corps, comprising the Leibstandard, Das Reich, and Totenkopf divisions, plus the newly formed SS Division Viking. These four divisions represented the cream of the Waffen SS, equipped with the newest German tanks and commanded by the most experienced officers in the organization. The preparation for Citadel revealed both the strengths and limitations of SS tactical doctrine. German intelligence had identified the approximate location of Soviet defensive positions, but completely underestimated their depth and sophistication. While SS planners prepared for breakthrough operations similar to those that had succeeded in 1941 and 1942, Soviet engineers were constructing the most elaborate defensive system in military history. Marshal Georgy Zhukov had used the months of German preparation to create defense-in-depth positions extending over 200 kilometers behind the front lines. Multiple lines of anti-tank ditches, minefields, and artillery positions were designed to channel German attacks into predetermined killing zones. Most importantly, Zhukov had assembled a strategic reserve of over 1,500 tanks and self-propelled guns that could counterattack German spearheads once they had been weakened by defensive fire. SS reconnaissance units detected some elements of these preparations, but their reports were dismissed by higher headquarters as Soviet propaganda designed to discourage German attack. The institutional arrogance that had served SS formations well in earlier campaigns now worked against them, creating dangerous overconfidence about their ability to overcome any obstacle through superior tactics and motivation. The opening phase of the offensive seemed to validate SS confidence. When the attack began at dawn on July 5th, SS formations achieved initial breakthrough that penetrated 15 kilometers into Soviet positions by the end of the first day. The new Tiger and Panther tanks proved devastatingly effective against most Soviet armor, while innovative combined arms tactics allowed SS infantry to clear defensive positions that had stopped earlier attacks. SS Hauptsturmführer Michael Wittmann, commanding a Tiger tank company in the Leibstandard, exemplified this early success. In the first 2 days of fighting, his company destroyed over 40 Soviet tanks and self-propelled guns while suffering only minor damage to their own vehicles. Such achievements seemed to prove that German technological and tactical superiority could still overcome Soviet numerical advantages. But the apparent success was deceptive. Soviet defensive tactics were designed to absorb initial German attacks while inflicting maximum casualties on elite formations that couldn't be easily replaced. Each kilometer of advance cost SS divisions hundreds of men and dozens of irreplaceable tanks. More ominously, Soviet resistance was stiffening rather than collapsing as German commanders had expected. The battle's turning point came on July 12th at the village of Prokhorovka, where the Leibstandard encountered the 5th Guards tank army in what became the largest tank engagement in military history. Over 1,200 armored vehicles clashed in a battle that lasted from dawn to dusk, creating a spectacle that participants described as hell on earth. SS Obersturmbannführer Joachim Paper, leading a panzer regiment in the engagement, later described the intensity. The entire battlefield was covered with burning tanks and vehicles. Smoke was so thick we could barely see 100 meters. Radio communications broke down completely. We were fighting by instinct and experience alone. It was like a medieval battle fought with modern weapons. The tactical details of Prokhorovka revealed both SS tactical evolution and its limitations. SS tank crews demonstrated superior individual skills, often defeating multiple Soviet opponents in single engagements. Their coordination between armor, infantry, and air support remained better than anything the Soviets could achieve. But these tactical advantages were overwhelmed by Soviet numerical superiority and their willingness to accept casualties that would have been unthinkable for German commanders. More significantly, the battle revealed that Soviet tactical sophistication had improved dramatically since 1941. The T-34 crews facing SS forces at Prokhorovka were veterans with 2 years of combat experience. not the poorly trained conscripts that had been massacred during the early stages of Operation Barbarossa. They used terrain effectively, concentrated their forces at decisive points, and demonstrated a level of tactical initiative that German intelligence had not anticipated. The result was a Pyrrhic victory that destroyed SS offensive capability even while achieving limited tactical success. The Leibstandarte succeeded in holding the battlefield at the end of July 12th, but they had lost over 70 of their armored strength and suffered nearly 5,000 casualties. Similar losses throughout 2 SS Panzer Corps made further offensive operations impossible. Even more damaging was the psychological impact on SS morale. For the first time since their formation, elite SS divisions had been fought to a standstill by an enemy they had been taught to consider racially and tactically inferior. The mythology of SS invincibility, carefully cultivated through years of victory, began to crack under the pressure of tactical stalemate. SS Brigadefuhrer Fritz Kramer, serving as a senior staff officer during the battle, later reflected on this psychological transformation. Kursk was the moment when many of our soldiers began to doubt not just the possibility of victory, but the fundamental assumptions about racial superiority that had motivated their service. When elite troops can't achieve decisive results despite every advantage, it forces a re-evaluation of everything you believed. The strategic situation deteriorated further when Allied forces launched their invasion of Sicily on July 10th, forcing Hitler to divert troops from the Eastern Front to defend Italy. Operation Citadel was officially canceled on July 13th, leaving German forces in exposed positions without having achieved any strategic objectives. For the Waffen SS, this cancellation was particularly devastating. Their elite divisions had been consumed in an operation that accomplished nothing while permanently weakening German offensive capability on the Eastern Front. Worse yet, the failure occurred despite SS forces having every advantage that German military industry and tactical doctrine could provide. The aftermath of Kursk forced fundamental changes in SS strategic thinking and tactical doctrine. The era of large-scale offensive operations was clearly over, replaced by a defensive strategy that emphasized mobile counterattacks and delaying actions. SS formations would have to adapt to fighting outnumbered and outgunned, relying on tactical skill rather than material superiority to achieve limited objectives. This transition was complicated by the fact that SS organizational culture remained oriented toward offensive action and decisive victory. Defensive warfare required patience, careful resource management, and acceptance of limited gains, qualities that conflicted with the aggressive mentality that had originally made SS formations so effective. The personnel costs of Kursk also accelerated changes in SS recruitment and training that would affect the organization's character for the remainder of the war. The elite volunteer formations that had dominated SS ranks since 1940 had been decimated, forcing expansion of conscription and relaxation of physical and ideological standards. New SS recruits arriving in late 1943 were often teenagers with minimal training and limited commitment to Nazi ideology. They possessed neither the tactical expertise nor the fanatical motivation that had characterized earlier generations of SS soldiers. While they could still fight effectively under experienced leadership, they lacked the initiative and adaptability that had made SS formations superior to regular Wehrmacht units. By August 1943, as German forces retreated from the Kursk salient under constant Soviet pressure, the Waffen SS faced a strategic reality that no amount of tactical skill could overcome. They remained Germany's most capable military formations, but they were now fighting a war that favored industrial production over individual excellence, numerical superiority over tactical innovation. The failure at Kursk marked the end of SS offensive capability and the beginning of a long, costly retreat that would eventually lead back to the gates of Berlin. But it also demonstrated that even in defeat, SS formations retained tactical abilities that would make them formidable opponents for the remainder of the war. What came next would test whether tactical excellence could compensate for strategic failure, and whether elite soldiers could maintain their effectiveness while fighting for a cause that was clearly losing. Italian campaign, fighting in the Mediterranean, 1943 to 1945. The morning sun cast long shadows across the ruins of Monte Cassino as SS Oberfuhrer Ernst August Krag surveyed the aftermath of the Fourth Allied assault on the ancient monastery. It was May 18, 1944, and his men from the 16th SS Panzergrenadier Division had just completed one of the most skillful withdrawals in military history, fighting a delaying action that had cost the Allies 6 months and 55,000 casualties, while buying precious time for German defensive preparations throughout Italy. But as Krag watched the last of his soldiers disappear into the northern hills, he understood that this tactical masterpiece represented something profoundly different from the lightning victories that had made the Waffen SS legendary. This was warfare as engineering, not art, a methodical application of defensive expertise that revealed how completely the nature of SS operations had changed since the heady days of Blitzkrieg. The SS involvement in Italy had begun almost by accident when Mussolini's government collapsed in July 1943, leaving German forces dangerously exposed throughout the Mediterranean. While most Wehrmacht commanders advocated immediate withdrawal to prepared positions in northern Italy, Hitler was determined to defend as much Italian territory as possible, partly for strategic reasons and partly to demonstrate German resolve to increasingly nervous allies. This decision created opportunities for Waffen SS formations that had been decimated at Kursk and needed time to rebuild their strength. The mountainous terrain of central Italy was perfectly suited to defensive operations that maximized the impact of elite troops while minimizing the importance of numerical superiority. 4 SS commanders who had spent 2 years learning to fight outnumbered, Italy represented a chance to demonstrate that tactical skill could still overcome material disadvantages. The initial deployment brought together some of the most experienced SS formations still available for combat operations. The Leibstandard SS Adolf Hitler, rebuilt after its losses at Kursk, took positions in the mountains south of Rome. The 16th SS Panzergrenadier Division Reichsfuhrer SS, a newly formed unit commanded by concentration camp veterans, established defensive positions around Florence. Most significantly, individual SS battle groups were attached to Wehrmacht divisions throughout the peninsula, providing elite reinforcement for units that had been weakened by transfers to the Eastern Front. What these formations found in Italy was unlike any previous theater of SS operations. The terrain was so rugged that mechanized units often had to abandon their vehicles and fight as mountain infantry. Supply lines stretched across narrow mountain roads that could be interdicted by small partisan groups. Most challenging of all, they faced Allied opponents who possessed overwhelming advantages in artillery, air power, and naval gunfire support. These conditions forced SS commanders to develop tactical innovations that represented a complete departure from their traditional emphasis on aggressive maneuver warfare. SS Oberfuhrer Wilhelm Bittrich, commanding SS elements in the Gustav Line, pioneered what became known as elastic defense, a system of interlocking positions that could absorb enemy attacks while channeling them into predetermined killing zones. The technique was demonstrated most effectively during the First Battle of Monte Cassino in January 1944. Instead of attempting to hold fixed positions that could be overwhelmed by massive Allied firepower, Bittrich's men established multiple defensive lines that allowed tactical withdrawal without strategic retreat. When Allied forces captured the first line of positions, they found themselves under fire from higher elevations that had been carefully prepared and camouflaged. SS Hauptsturmführer George Meyer, commanding a company in these defenses, later described the psychological impact. The enemy could take our positions, but they couldn't hold them. Every advance brought them under fire from positions they couldn't see and couldn't suppress. After a few days, their morale would crack, and they would retreat to positions we had abandoned voluntarily. This tactical approach proved devastatingly effective against Allied forces that had been trained for mobile warfare in North Africa and were unprepared for the methodical requirements of mountain fighting. British and American units repeatedly captured tactical objectives only to find them untenable due to German fire from surrounding heights. Progress was measured in hundreds of yards rather than miles, and casualty rates reached levels that Allied commanders found difficult to sustain. But the success of SS defensive tactics came with a price that reflected the changing nature of their military role. Unlike previous campaigns, where SS formations had been spearheads of German offensive operations, in Italy, they became specialists in controlled withdrawal and delaying actions. Their primary mission was not to win decisive victories, but to inflict maximum casualties on Allied forces while preserving their own strength for future operations. This shift from offensive to defensive orientation required fundamental changes in SS training and psychology. Soldiers who had been conditioned to see retreat as failure had to learn that tactical withdrawal could be a form of victory if it achieved strategic objectives. Officers who had built their reputations on aggressive leadership had to develop patience and restraint that conflicted with traditional SS values. The transformation was exemplified by the career of Sturmbannführer Otto Skorzeny, who had gained fame earlier in the war for commando operations and special missions. In Italy, Skorzeny adapted his skills to the requirements of defensive warfare, developing innovative techniques for delaying Allied advances through sabotage, deception, and psychological warfare. His most successful operation involved the defense of the Anzio beachhead in early 1944. When Allied forces established their landing, conventional German response focused on immediate counterattack designed to drive them back into the sea. Skorzeny instead advocated a strategy of containment that would allow Allied forces to remain ashore while preventing them from advancing inland. The result was a 4-month siege that cost the Allies over 43,000 casualties while tying down divisions that could have been used elsewhere. Skorzeny's men used everything from sniper teams to propaganda loudspeakers to maintain pressure on Allied forces, creating a psychological atmosphere that one American commander described as more exhausting than combat. Such innovations demonstrated that SS tactical flexibility could adapt to any operational requirements, but they also revealed how completely the organization had been forced to abandon its original mission. Instead of implementing racial policies in conquered territory, SS formations in Italy were focused entirely on military objectives. Instead of fighting wars of annihilation against racially inferior opponents, they were engaged in professional military operations against technically sophisticated enemies. This change was reflected in the treatment of prisoners and civilians, which was significantly better in Italy than on the Eastern Front. While SS units still committed war crimes, particularly in response to partisan activities, the systematic murder that characterized their operations in Poland and Russia was largely absent from the Italian campaign. The improvement in SS conduct reflected both tactical necessity and changing personnel. The veteran officers who had participated in genocide on the Eastern Front had been killed or transferred, replaced by younger commanders whose primary experience was conventional military operations. Similarly, the ranks were increasingly filled with conscripts who lacked the ideological indoctrination that had motivated earlier generations of SS soldiers. SS Sturmbannführer Hans Weber, who commanded a battalion through most of the Italian campaign, later reflected on this transformation. "We were still SS, but we were fighting a different kind of war against a different kind of enemy. The racial struggle that had motivated our service seemed less relevant when you were facing American tanks and British artillery. We became soldiers first and SS men second." The Allied breakthrough at Cassino in May 1944 marked the beginning of the final phase of SS operations in Italy. As German forces retreated toward the Gothic Line in northern Italy, SS formations conducted a series of delaying actions that demonstrated both their tactical skill and their strategic limitations. The retreat was executed with precision that impressed even Allied commanders. SS units would establish defensive positions, inflict maximum casualties on advancing Allied forces, then withdraw to new positions before being overrun. Each delaying action bought time for German engineers to prepare more elaborate defenses further north, while SS losses remained manageable due to their superior tactical skills. But the strategic situation was deteriorating regardless of tactical success. Allied material superiority was so overwhelming that even perfect defensive tactics could only delay defeat, not prevent it. More importantly, the diversion of SS formations to Italy meant they weren't available for operations on the Eastern Front, where Soviet offensives were achieving breakthrough that threatened the survival of the Reich itself. By the time Germany surrendered in May 1945, SS formations in Italy had established a reputation as the most skilled defensive fighters in the German military. They had conducted textbook withdrawals, executed brilliant delaying actions, and demonstrated that elite troops could maintain effectiveness even under hopeless strategic conditions. But they had also spent 2 years fighting conventional military operations that had little connection to the ideological mission that had originally justified their existence. The SS formations that surrendered to Allied forces in northern Italy bore little resemblance to the racial warriors who had invaded Poland 6 years earlier. Their transformation from ideological crusaders to professional soldiers was complete, but it had come too late to affect the war's outcome or erase the crimes committed in their organization's name. Normandy Nightmare, D-Day, and the Western Front, 1944. The church bells of St. Miraglise were still ringing their alarm when SS Oberfuhrer Kurt Meyer received the telephone call that would define the rest of his life. It was 6:30 a.m. on June 6, 1944, and the 33-year-old commander of the 12th SS Panzer Division Hitlerjugend was being ordered to counterattack what Allied intelligence would later call the largest seaborne invasion in human history. As Meyer raced toward the Normandy coast in his command vehicle, he carried with him the hopes of a dying Reich and the burden of leading teenagers into battle against the combined might of the Western Allies. What Meyer couldn't know as his division moved toward the sound of naval gunfire was that D-Day would mark the beginning of the end for the Waffen SS as an effective military force. The campaign that followed would demonstrate both their tactical brilliance and their strategic irrelevance, proving that even the most elite formations couldn't overcome the industrial might of nations that had mobilized their entire economies for total war. The SS presence in Normandy reflected the desperate expedients that characterized German strategy in 1944. With most veteran formations committed to the collapsing Eastern Front, Hitler had been forced to deploy units that would have been held in reserve under normal circumstances. The 12th SS Panzer Division, composed primarily of 17 and 18-year-old Hitler Youth volunteers, represented a new generation of SS soldiers who possessed fanatical motivation but lacked the combat experience that had made their predecessors so formidable. These young soldiers had been raised from childhood on Nazi propaganda that portrayed the coming battle as the final struggle between European civilization and Anglo-American decadence. Unlike veteran SS formations that had developed professional military skills through years of combat, the Hitlerjugend Division combined ideological extremism with tactical naivety that would prove both dangerous and tragic. SS Untersturmführer Wilhelm Krauss, a 19-year-old platoon leader in the division, exemplified this deadly combination of enthusiasm and inexperience. In his final letter home, written on the evening before D-Day, he wrote, "Tomorrow we will drive the invaders back into the sea and prove to the world that German youth will never surrender. Our Führer has given us the greatest honor possible, the chance to die for the fatherland." Such sentiments were typical throughout the division, creating a psychological atmosphere that impressed even veteran Wehrmacht officers. But fanatical motivation couldn't compensate for tactical shortcomings that became apparent as soon as the division entered combat. The initial German response to the Allied landings revealed both the strengths and weaknesses of SS tactical doctrine when applied to defensive operations against technically superior opponents. Meyer's division was ordered to counterattack the Canadian forces advancing inland from Juno Beach, a mission that required coordinated operations between armor, infantry, and artillery against enemies who possessed overwhelming air superiority. The attack, launched on the afternoon of June 7th, demonstrated the tactical innovation that had made SS formations legendary while also revealing their limitations when facing modern combined arms opposition. Meyer divided his division into multiple battle groups that advanced along separate axes, hoping to achieve local numerical superiority at decisive points while preventing Allied forces from concentrating their firepower. The tactic worked initially, creating confusion among Canadian defenders who found themselves under attack from unexpected directions. SS Panzer crews, despite their youth and limited experience, displayed the aggressive initiative that had always characterized elite German formations. Several Canadian positions were overrun in the first hours of fighting, and for a brief moment it seemed possible that the counterattack might succeed. But the tactical success was short-lived. Allied air power, operating from bases in England just minutes away from the battlefield, quickly intervened with devastating effect. Rocket-firing Typhoons and P-47 Thunderbolts caught SS armored columns in the open, destroying dozens of tanks and vehicles that couldn't be replaced. Even more importantly, Allied naval gunfire from offshore battleships and cruisers provided fire support of unprecedented accuracy and volume. SS Hauptsturmführer Hans Siegel, commanding a panzer battalion in the counterattack, later described the overwhelming nature of Allied firepower. We had never experienced anything like it. Every movement brought down artillery fire that seemed to come from every direction. Aircraft appeared within minutes of any concentration. It was like fighting an enemy who could see everything and strike anywhere. The failure of the initial counterattack forced SS commanders to adapt their tactics to conditions they had never previously encountered. Instead of the mobile warfare that had made them famous, they had to learn positional defense against opponents who possessed every possible advantage except individual soldier quality. This adaptation produced some of the most skillful defensive fighting in SS history. Meyer's division established a series of strongpoints around the Norman town of Caen that held up Allied advances for over a month despite constant attack by superior forces. Each position was carefully sited to provide mutual support, while elaborate camouflage and deception measures minimized the effectiveness of Allied air reconnaissance. The defense of Caen revealed both the tactical expertise and moral corruption that had always characterized SS operations. On the military side, young SS soldiers displayed remarkable skill in adapting to defensive warfare, using innovative techniques to maximize the effectiveness of limited resources. They employed snipers with exceptional skill, coordinated artillery fire with precision that impressed Allied observers, and demonstrated individual initiative that consistently frustrated enemy plans. But the same period also witnessed some of the worst war crimes committed by SS forces in Western Europe. The combination of fanatical indoctrination, combat stress, and knowledge that defeat meant occupation of Germany created conditions that led to systematic murder of prisoners and civilians. The massacre of Canadian prisoners at Authie and Buron became emblematic of SS conduct during the Normandy campaign. SS Runführer Gustav Knittel, one of the few participants who survived the war, later attempted to explain the mentality that made such crimes possible. We had been taught that this was the final battle for European civilization. Every enemy soldier we captured would eventually return a fight against us. Every civilian who helped them was a traitor to the race. In that context, mercy seemed like weakness we couldn't afford. Such rationalizations revealed how completely SS ideology had corrupted normal military values, even among soldiers who displayed undeniable courage in combat. The same formations that executed brilliant tactical maneuvers also committed systematic murder, creating a military culture where professional excellence and criminal behavior coexisted without apparent contradiction. The Allied breakthrough at the end of July marked the beginning of the final phase of SS operations in Normandy. Operation Cobra, the American offensive that shattered German defensive lines west of St. Lo, created conditions that favored mobile warfare for the first time since D-Day. But by this point, SS formations lacked the strength and equipment necessary to take advantage of their traditional tactical superiority. The attempted German counterattack at Mortain on August 7th demonstrated both the persistent tactical skill of SS formations and their complete strategic irrelevance by this stage of the war. Meyer's division, reinforced by elements from other SS formations, executed a night attack that achieved complete tactical surprise and advanced nearly 10 kilometers before being halted by American resistance. For a few hours, it seemed possible that German forces might succeed in cutting off the American breakthrough and restoring the defensive line in Normandy. SS Panzer crews fought with the same skill and determination that had characterized their predecessors at Kursk and Kharkov, while SS infantry demonstrated the tactical flexibility that had always made them formidable opponents. But the strategic situation made tactical success irrelevant. Allied material superiority was so overwhelming that even perfect execution of German plans couldn't have achieved decisive results. More importantly, the diversion of resources to the Mortain attack weakened German defenses elsewhere, contributing to the encirclement of German forces in the Falaise Pocket. The destruction of Army Group West in the Falaise Pocket marked the effective end of organized German resistance in Western Europe. SS formations, despite their tactical skill and fanatical resistance, were ground to pieces in the same industrial warfare that was consuming Wehrmacht units throughout the theater. The 12th SS Panzer Division, which had entered Normandy with over 20,000 men and 150 tanks, escaped the pocket with fewer than 3,000 survivors and no operational armored vehicles. Similar losses throughout SS formations in Normandy meant that the Western Front had consumed nearly 100,000 of the Waffen SS most experienced soldiers and officers. As surviving SS units retreated toward the German border in late August 1944, they carried with them the knowledge that their tactical excellence had proved insufficient to overcome the material superiority of fully mobilized industrial nations. The elite formations that had once seemed capable of achieving impossible victories were now fighting merely to delay inevitable defeat. The lessons of Normandy would prove crucial for the final phase of SS operations, but they also demonstrated that no amount of tactical skill could compensate for strategic disadvantages that had become insurmountable by 1944. Market Garden opposition. Arnhem's defenders, September 1944. The radio crackled to life in the headquarters of 2 SS Panzer Corps as reports flooded in from observers throughout the Netherlands. Massive airborne operation in progress. Thousands of parachutes and gliders. Enemy forces landing at Eindhoven, Nijmegen, and Arnhem. It was 2:15 p.m. on September 17, 1944, and SS Oberfuhrer Wilhelm Bittrich was about to face the greatest test of his military career, defending against Operation Market Garden, the largest airborne operation in history. What made this moment even more remarkable was that Bittrich's 2 SS Panzer Corps was supposed to be finished as a fighting force. The 9th SS Panzer Division Hohenstaufen and 10th SS Panzer Division Frundsberg had been virtually destroyed during the Normandy campaign, their survivors evacuated across the Seine with minimal equipment. They were in the Netherlands supposedly to rest, refit, and prepare for transfer to the Eastern Front. Instead, they were about to demonstrate that even battered SS formations could achieve tactical miracles under the right circumstances. The irony was not lost on Allied intelligence officers who had dismissed German forces in the Netherlands as students, invalids, and old men incapable of serious resistance. What they failed to understand was that the SS formations resting near Arnhem retained their most important asset: experienced officers and NCOs who had survived years of combat and learned to maximize the effectiveness of whatever resources they possessed. Bittrich's immediate response to the Allied landings revealed the tactical flexibility that had always characterized elite SS formations. Instead of attempting to defend everywhere at once, he concentrated his limited forces at the most critical objectives while using small detachments to harass enemy operations throughout the operational area. His decision to commit the bulk of his armor to defending the Arnhem Road Bridge would prove decisive for the entire operation. The initial phase of the battle demonstrated both the possibilities and limitations of SS tactical doctrine when applied to urban warfare against elite opponents. British paratroops from the 1st Airborne Division were among the finest soldiers in the Allied military, equipped with the latest weapons and supported by a sophisticated intelligence network. But they were also fighting in small, isolated groups against defenders who possessed intimate knowledge of the terrain and complete freedom of movement. SS Hauptsturmführer Victor Grabner, commanding the reconnaissance battalion of the Hohenstaufen Division, exemplified the kind of aggressive leadership that made SS formations so dangerous even when outnumbered. When British paratroops seized the northern end of the Arnhem Bridge, Grabner immediately organized a counterattack using whatever forces were immediately available. 2 companies of infantry, a handful of armored vehicles, and some local police units. The attack, launched just hours after the initial British landing, demonstrated both the strengths and weaknesses of improvised SS operations. Grabner's men displayed remarkable initiative and coordination, executing complex urban maneuvers without detailed planning or preparation. They used innovative tactics that combined traditional infantry assault techniques with psychological warfare designed to demoralize isolated enemy units. But the operation also revealed the cost of aggressive tactics against well-prepared opponents. Grabner himself was killed in the first hour of fighting, along with most of his immediate staff. His reconnaissance battalion suffered over 60 casualties in the first day, losses that would have been prohibitive for any formation with conventional replacement policies. Yet from a tactical perspective, the attack succeeded beyond all reasonable expectations. British forces were prevented from establishing secure defensive positions around the bridge approaches, while German reinforcements gained time to organize more substantial counterattacks. More importantly, the psychological impact of immediate German resistance disrupted Allied operational timing in ways that would prove decisive for the entire campaign. The second phase of the battle, lasting from September 18th to 20th, showcased SS urban warfare techniques that had been perfected during years of fighting in Stalingrad, Warsaw, and dozens of other cities across Europe. SS commanders understood that urban terrain favored defenders who could coordinate fire from multiple directions while remaining concealed from enemy observation. The Frundsberg Division, commanded by SS Oberfuhrer Heinz Harmel, demonstrated this tactical expertise during the fighting for Arnhem suburbs. Instead of attempting to recapture the entire city through frontal assault, Harmel's men systematically isolated British positions by controlling key road junctions and communication nodes. Their techniques were sophisticated enough to impress even British commanders who had studied German urban warfare methods for years. SS soldiers used sewers and basement tunnels to approach British positions from unexpected directions. They employed snipers with exceptional skill, often engaging targets at ranges that exceeded normal small arms effectiveness. Most importantly, they coordinated their operations with artillery observers who could direct fire with precision that minimized civilian casualties while maximizing military effect. SS Untersturmführer Hans Mahler, commanding a company in these operations, later described the tactical challenge. The British were excellent soldiers who used terrain effectively and fought with determination. But they were thinking in terms of conventional defensive warfare, while we had learned to make every building a fortress and every street a killing zone. The psychological aspects of the battle revealed another dimension of SS tactical doctrine that often went unnoticed by outside observers. German commanders understood that British airborne forces were elite troops whose morale depended on maintaining offensive momentum and confidence in ultimate victory. British soldiers who had fought German forces elsewhere knew that SS formations were among the most dangerous opponents in the German military. The knowledge that they were facing elite SS divisions rather than second-rate garrison troops had a measurable impact on Allied morale and tactical decision-making. The third phase of the battle, from September 21st to 25th, demonstrated how SS tactical flexibility could adapt to changing operational requirements without losing effectiveness. As it became clear that Allied ground forces would not reach Arnhem in time to relieve the airborne forces, the tactical situation shifted from mobile warfare to siege operations. SS formations excelled in this new environment, using techniques that had been perfected during defensive operations in Italy and Normandy. They established multiple lines of containment around British positions, preventing breakout attempts while gradually reducing the defensive perimeter through methodical application of fire and movement tactics. The final assault on the Arnhem Bridge conducted by elements of both SS divisions working in close coordination, represented urban warfare at its most sophisticated level. SS commanders had learned to coordinate armor, infantry, artillery, and even air support in confined spaces where traditional combined arms doctrine was impossible to apply. The operation was planned with meticulous attention to detail that reflected years of combat experience. Artillery fire was precisely calculated to destroy specific British positions without damaging the bridge structure that German forces needed to preserve. Infantry assault routes were coordinated to prevent friendly fire incidents while ensuring that British defenders faced simultaneous attacks from multiple directions. Most importantly, SS commanders had learned to anticipate British tactical responses and prepare countermeasures that neutralized Allied advantages in training and equipment. When British forces attempted to break out toward the river, they found that SS forces had anticipated the move and prepared positions that turned the breakout attempt into a devastating ambush. The final statistics of the Arnhem operation told a story that would have seemed impossible based on the relative strength of forces involved. British airborne forces, among the elite formations in the Allied military, had been decisively defeated by German formations that were supposedly resting after suffering catastrophic losses in Normandy. But the victory came at a cost that reflected the changed strategic situation facing German forces by late 1944. SS formations had expended irreplaceable resources defeating an operation that, even if successful, would not have significantly altered the overall trajectory of the war. Their tactical brilliance had achieved operational success that possessed no strategic significance. More ominously, the battle revealed how completely SS formations had been forced to adapt to defensive warfare against technologically superior opponents. The aggressive, mobile tactics that had made them legendary during the early years of the war had been replaced by sophisticated defensive techniques that emphasized conservation of resources and maximum utilization of terrain advantages. As surviving British airborne forces evacuated across the Rhine on September 25th, SS commanders could take satisfaction in having achieved one of the most impressive tactical victories in the history of airborne warfare. But they also understood that such victories could no longer change the fundamental trajectory of a war that Germany was clearly losing. The lessons of Arnhem would prove crucial for the final phase of SS operations, but they also demonstrated that even perfect tactical execution couldn't overcome the strategic disadvantages that were making German defeat inevitable. Battle of the Bulge, Hitler's last gamble, December 1944. The snow began falling at midnight on December 15th, 1944, blanketing the Ardennes forest in a deceptive silence that would soon be shattered by the thunder of the largest German offensive since Kursk. In a camouflage command post near the Belgian border, SS Oberfuhrer Hermann Priest checked his watch one final time before speaking into his radio. All units, this is Wacht am Rhein. Execute in 60 minutes. Hitler's last great gamble was about to begin, and the Waffen SS would play the starring role in an operation that represented both their tactical zenith and their strategic death agony. What made this moment so significant was not just the scale of the operation. Over 200,000 German soldiers supported by 1,000 tanks and assault guns, but the fact that SS formations comprised the spearhead of an offensive designed to reverse the entire trajectory of the war in Western Europe. The 6th SS Panzer Army, commanded by SS Oberfuhrer Joseph Sepp Dietrich, included the most powerful SS formations still available. The 1st SS Panzer Division Leibstandard, the 2nd SS Panzer Division Das Reich, and the 12th SS Panzer Division Hitlerjugend, rebuilt after its destruction in Normandy. These weren't just military units. They were the survivors of 6 years of warfare, the remnants of formations that had conquered Poland, France, Yugoslavia, and large portions of the Soviet Union. Their commanders were veterans who had learned to extract maximum effectiveness from limited resources. Their soldiers, despite years of losses, retained the tactical expertise and aggressive spirit that had made the Waffen SS legendary. But they were also fighting for a cause that everyone from Hitler down to the newest recruit understood was probably lost. The Ardennes offensive represented a desperate attempt to achieve a decisive victory that might force the Western Allies to negotiate a separate peace, allowing Germany to concentrate its remaining strength against the Soviet Union. It was militarily brilliant and strategically hopeless, a perfect embodiment of the contradictions that had always characterized SS operations. The opening phase of the offensive demonstrated both the possibilities and limitations of SS tactical doctrine when applied to winter warfare against prepared opponents. Unlike the Wehrmacht formations that formed the bulk of German attacking forces, SS units had been carefully trained for operations in snow and cold. Their soldiers possessed specialized equipment and techniques that allowed them to maintain effectiveness under conditions that paralyzed less experienced formations. SS Hauptsturmführer Joachim Paper, commanding Kampfgruppe Paper, a reinforced regiment built around the 1st SS Panzer Regiment, exemplified this tactical adaptation. His unit had been specifically configured for rapid advance through difficult terrain, combining the firepower of heavy tanks with the mobility of armored infantry and the flexibility of combat engineers. Paper's advance during the first 48 hours of the offensive became one of the most studied examples of small unit tactics in military history. His Kampfgruppe penetrated over 50 kilometers into American lines, destroying several defensive positions and capturing hundreds of prisoners while suffering minimal casualties. The speed and coordination of his advance created panic among American commanders who had considered their positions secure. The tactical techniques employed by Paper's unit revealed how completely SS doctrine had evolved since the early days of the war. Instead of the massed frontal assaults that had characterized earlier SS operations, the Kampfgruppe used sophisticated infiltration tactics that allowed them to bypass strong enemy positions while attacking weak points with concentrated force. Their coordination between different types of units was particularly impressive. Tank crews, infantry squads, and artillery observers worked together with a precision that reflected years of combat experience and training. Radio communications remained effective despite winter conditions and enemy jamming efforts. Most importantly, individual soldiers at every level displayed the initiative and adaptability that had always distinguished elite formations from conventional military units. But the early success masked fundamental problems that would doom the entire operation. Despite their tactical skill, SS formations lacked the logistical support necessary to sustain offensive operations against an enemy that possessed overwhelming material superiority. Fuel shortages forced commanders to abandon vehicles that could have been repaired. Ammunition shortages prevented exploitation of tactical successes. Most critically, the offensive had been planned based on optimistic assumptions about American resistance that proved completely incorrect. The massacre at Malmedy on December 17th illustrated both the tactical effectiveness and moral corruption that characterized SS operations throughout the war. When Paper's Kampfgruppe encountered a column of American artillery troops, the tactical situation seemed straightforward: capture or eliminate the enemy force and continue the advance. But what happened next revealed how completely years of ideological indoctrination and combat brutalization had corrupted normal military behavior. Instead of processing the American prisoners according to international law, SS soldiers herded them into a field and machine-gunned them en masse. 84 American soldiers were murdered in cold blood, creating an atrocity that would define American perceptions of the Waffen SS for generations. SS Runtenführer George Fleps, one of the perpetrators who survived the war, later attempted to justify the massacre. "We were advancing against a timetable that allowed no delays. Processing prisoners would have required guards and transportation we couldn't spare. The mission came first, and eliminating potential resistance was part of completing the mission." Such rationalizations revealed how completely military professionalism had been subordinated to criminal mentality within SS formations. The same tactical excellence that made them so effective in combat also made their war crimes more devastating and systematic than anything committed by conventional military units. The American response to Malmedy transformed the character of the entire campaign. Instead of the collapse in morale that German planners had anticipated, news of the massacre stiffened American resistance throughout the sector. Orders went out to American units that SS prisoners were not to be taken, creating a cycle of brutality that escalated throughout the remainder of the battle. More importantly, the massacre focused Allied attention on SS formations in ways that compromised their tactical effectiveness. Intelligence resources were concentrated on tracking SS movements, while combat units received specific training on countering SS tactical methods. The psychological warfare advantages that SS formations had traditionally enjoyed were neutralized by their own criminal conduct. The Siege of Bastogne provided the climactic test of SS capabilities under conditions that perfectly suited their tactical strengths. The American 101st Airborne Division, surrounded and outnumbered, was defending positions that could be attacked from multiple directions simultaneously. German forces possessed local numerical superiority and the tactical initiative. Weather conditions prevented effective Allied air support. Yet the SS formations committed to reducing Bastogne failed to achieve decisive results despite every apparent advantage. The 1st SS Panzer Division, supported by elements from other SS units, launched repeated attacks that achieved initial penetrations without breaking American resistance. Each tactical success was followed by American counterattacks that restored the defensive perimeter. The failure at Bastogne revealed fundamental changes in the tactical balance between elite German formations and regular Allied units that had occurred by late 1944. American airborne troops possessed equipment, training, and experience that made them nearly equal to SS formations in individual combat effectiveness. More importantly, they were supported by artillery and air power that could be concentrated rapidly at decisive points. SS Oberfuhrer Fritz Kramer, serving as Chief of Staff for the 6th SS Panzer Army, later analyzed the tactical lessons. We were no longer fighting the same enemy we had defeated in 1940 and 1941. These were veteran soldiers with modern equipment and unlimited support. Our tactical advantages had been eroded by years of combat experience on their side and material losses on ours. The final phase of the offensive, from December 24th to January 3rd, demonstrated both the persistence and futility of SS tactical excellence when applied to hopeless strategic situations. Despite knowing that the operation had failed to achieve its objectives, SS formations continued attacking with the same determination and skill that had characterized their earlier successes. The 2nd SS Panzer Division Das Reich, committed to the final push toward the Meuse River, exemplified this combination of tactical brilliance and strategic irrelevance. The division executed textbook breakthrough operations that penetrated several kilometers into American defensive positions, demonstrating that SS formations retained their combat effectiveness despite months of continuous fighting. But these tactical achievements accomplished nothing of strategic significance. Each kilometer gained cost irreplaceable tanks, vehicles, and experienced personnel that Germany couldn't afford to lose. More importantly, the diversion of resources to maintain failed attacks prevented German forces from conducting the organized withdrawal that might have preserved their strength for future operations. By January 3rd, 1945, when Hitler finally authorized withdrawal from the Ardennes salient, German forces had suffered over 100,000 casualties, including many of the most experienced officers and NCOs in the SS formations. The Western Front had consumed the strategic reserve that might have been used to defend against the Soviet offensive that everyone knew was coming. The tactical statistics of the Bulge offensive told a story that military historians would study for decades. SS formations had consistently outfought their American opponents at the tactical level, achieving local superiority and breakthrough that exceeded reasonable expectations given their material disadvantages. Individual SS soldiers and small units had displayed tactical skill and determination that impressed even their enemies. But these tactical achievements had been strategically meaningless, consuming the last reserves of an organization that could no longer replace its losses. The Waffen SS emerged from the Bulge as technically proficient as ever, but reduced to a shadow of its former strength and committed to defending a Reich that was clearly doomed. What happened next would determine whether tactical excellence could provide any meaningful resistance to the industrial might of fully mobilized Allied nations closing in from east and west. Eastern collapse. Retreat from the Soviet advance. 1944 to 1945. The earth trembled beneath the feet of SS-Oberfuhrer Felix Steiner as he crouched in a hastily dug command post near the Baltic coast. It was January 12, 1945, and the sound rolling across the frozen landscape wasn't thunder. It was the greatest artillery barrage in military history. Over 9,000 Soviet guns announcing the beginning of the Vistula-Oder offensive that would carry the Red Army to the gates of Berlin in just 3 weeks. For Steiner and the remnants of his 3 SS Panzer Corps, this moment marked the beginning of the final collapse of German resistance on the Eastern Front. What made this artillery barrage so terrifying wasn't just its scale, but what it represented. The transformation of the Red Army from the disorganized, poorly equipped force that had been devastated in 1941 into the most powerful military machine in the world. The Soviets who attacked that January morning possessed overwhelming advantages in every category of military strength: manpower, artillery, tanks, aircraft, and most importantly, combat experience gained through 4 years of the most brutal warfare in human history. Against this avalanche of steel and fire stood the scattered remnants of SS formations that had once seemed invincible. The divisions that bore famous names, Leibstandard, Das Reich, Totenkopf, Viking, were shadows of their former strength, cobbled together from survivors of previous battles and reinforced with teenagers and old men drafted from the collapsing Reich. Yet they remained Germany's most capable fighting formations, the last barrier between Soviet forces and the heartland of Europe. The opening phase of the Soviet offensive revealed both the continued tactical excellence of SS formations and the complete futility of their resistance. SS Hauptsturmführer Johannes Rudolf Mühlenkamp, commanding what remained of the 5th SS Panzer Division Viking, had positioned his men in defensive positions that represented years of accumulated expertise in fighting Soviet forces. The positions were masterpieces of defensive engineering. Multiple lines of trenches and bunkers sited to provide mutual support, anti-tank obstacles positioned to channel Soviet armor into killing zones, camouflaged artillery positions that could deliver devastating fire while remaining hidden from enemy observation. Under normal circumstances, these defenses might have held up Soviet attacks for weeks. But these weren't normal circumstances. The artillery barrage that preceded the Soviet infantry assault was unlike anything previously experienced on the Eastern Front. For 6 hours, shells fell at a rate of 1 every 3 seconds along the entire length of the German defensive line. Telephone communications were severed, bunkers collapsed, and carefully prepared defensive positions disappeared under the weight of high explosives. When the barrage finally lifted and Soviet infantry began their advance, they found that many German defensive positions had simply ceased to exist. The survivors of Mühlenkamp's division emerged from their shelters to find themselves facing odds that exceeded 10 to 1, supported by tank formations that possessed quantitative and qualitative superiority over anything the Germans could deploy. Yet even under these hopeless conditions, SS formations demonstrated the tactical skill that had made them legendary. Instead of attempting to hold fixed positions that could be overwhelmed by Soviet firepower, SS commanders implemented flexible defensive tactics that had been developed during 3 years of retreat warfare. The technique, perfected by commanders like SS Oberfuhrer Hermann Bulke, involved establishing multiple defensive lines that could absorb Soviet attacks while preserving German combat strength for counterattacks. When Soviet forces broke through the first line of positions, they found themselves under fire from previously hidden positions that had been carefully prepared for just such contingencies. SS Untersturmführer Hans Weber, commanding a company in these operations, later described the tactical challenge. "We knew we couldn't stop them. Nobody could have stopped that kind of attack. Our mission was to delay them long enough for civilians to evacuate and for other units to establish new defensive positions further west. Every hour we bought cost us men we couldn't replace, but might save thousands of German lives behind us." This mission, fighting delaying actions to protect civilian evacuation, represented a fundamental transformation in SS operational priorities that would have been unthinkable earlier in the war. The formations that had once spearheaded wars of racial conquest were now serving as shields for the very populations they had previously oppressed. The psychological impact of this role reversal was profound for soldiers who had been indoctrinated with beliefs about racial superiority and inevitable victory. SS veterans who had participated in the massacre of civilians in occupied territories now found themselves dying to protect German civilians fleeing from Soviet advance forces that were implementing their own policies of revenge and retribution. The evacuation of East Prussia provided the most dramatic example of this transformation. As Soviet forces broke through German defensive lines and advanced toward the Baltic coast, over 2 million German civilians began a desperate flight westward through territory that had been German for centuries. SS formations, despite their own desperate situation, were ordered to provide security for these refugee columns. The 4th SS Police Panzer Grenadier Division, reduced to less than 3,000 effective soldiers, was assigned to protect evacuation routes used by over 100,000 civilians fleeing toward the port of Danzig. The mission required tactical skills that no military academy had ever taught. SS soldiers had to fight conventional rearguard actions against pursuing Soviet forces while simultaneously organizing and protecting civilian columns that stretched for dozens of kilometers. They had to coordinate with naval forces evacuating refugees by sea while maintaining defensive positions that prevented Soviet breakthrough to the coast. SS Brigadefuhrer Fritz Witt, commanding remnants of several SS formations during these operations, later described the emotional impact. These weren't abstract military objectives. These were German families, children, old people who would die if we failed. Many of our soldiers were fighting to protect their own relatives. It gave desperate meaning to battles we knew we couldn't win. The siege of Breslau demonstrated both the tactical capabilities and strategic limitations of SS defensive expertise when applied to urban warfare under hopeless conditions. The city, surrounded by Soviet forces in February 1945, became a fortress defended by a mixture of SS troops, Wehrmacht units, Volkssturm militia, and civilian volunteers. The SS formations in Breslau, commanded by SS Oberfuhrer Karl Henk, had learned to maximize the effectiveness of limited resources through techniques developed during years of siege warfare. They established overlapping fields of fire that covered every approach to the city center. They used the underground infrastructure, sewers, basements, tunnels, to maintain communication and coordinate defensive operations even when surface movement became impossible. Most importantly, they had learned to integrate civilian workers into military operations in ways that multiplied their effective strength. Women and teenagers served as ammunition carriers, messengers, and medical personnel. Elderly men operated anti-aircraft guns and maintained defensive positions. The entire civilian population became part of the defensive system. The tactical results were remarkable. Breslau held out for over 3 months against odds that exceeded 20-1, tying down entire Soviet Army Corps that could have been used elsewhere. The garrison inflicted casualties on Soviet forces that were many times their own strength while preventing the capture of a major industrial and transportation center. But the human cost was devastating. By the time Breslau finally surrendered in May 1945, over 40,000 civilians had died from combat, disease, and starvation. The SS formations that had begun the siege with 15,000 men were reduced to fewer than 2,000 survivors. The tactical success had been achieved through systematic sacrifice of everyone involved. The final battles in Pomerania and Silesia revealed the complete breakdown of traditional military organization that characterized the last months of SS operations on the Eastern Front. Formations that had once been organized according to strict table of organization and equipment were now improvised battle groups, combining whatever personnel and equipment remained available. SS Camp Grupp-Steiner, named after its commander, included remnants of at least 6 different SS divisions, plus Wehrmacht units, foreign volunteers, and even some concentration camp guards who had been pressed into frontline service. The group's equipment included German tanks, captured Soviet vehicles, horse-drawn artillery, and weapons that had been improvised in workshops throughout the collapsing Reich. Yet this improvised formation fought with effectiveness that continued to impress Soviet commanders who had learned to respect SS tactical capabilities. In a series of delaying actions across northern Germany, Kampfgruppe Steiner repeatedly achieved local tactical success against superior forces, demonstrating that SS tactical expertise could adapt to any organizational structure or equipment limitations. The final statistics of SS operations on the Eastern Front told a story that would influence military thinking for decades. Despite being consistently outnumbered and outgunned, SS formations had inflicted casualties on Soviet forces that exceeded their own losses by ratios of 3 or 4 to 1. They had demonstrated tactical flexibility and innovative capabilities that surpassed anything achieved by conventional military formations. But these tactical achievements had been strategically meaningless, accomplished at the cost of consuming the most experienced and capable soldiers in the German military. By April 1945, SS formations on the Eastern Front existed only in name, their remnants scattered among dozens of improvised battle groups that possessed little resemblance to the elite divisions that had invaded the Soviet Union 4 years earlier. The survivors carried with them the knowledge that their tactical excellence had been insufficient to overcome the industrial and demographic advantages possessed by their enemies. More tragically, they also carried the knowledge that their organization's criminal conduct had made negotiated peace impossible, ensuring that the war would continue until Germany was completely destroyed. As Soviet forces approached Berlin in the final weeks of the war, the remaining SS formations prepared for battles that everyone understood would be their last. The criminal units, Dirlewanger and Kaminsky brigades, the screams echoing through the rubble-strewn streets of Warsaw's Old Town on August 5th, 1944, marked one of the darkest chapters in the already blood-soaked history of the Waffen SS. As SS Oberfuhrer Oskar Dirlewanger watched his men drag civilians from basement shelters and execute them in the street, he was conducting what he called anti-partisan operations, but what history would remember as systematic extermination. His unit, officially designated the 36th Waffen Grenadier Division of the SS Dirlewanger, represented the absolute nadir of an organization that had always balanced military excellence with criminal brutality. What made the Dirlewanger Brigade so significant wasn't just the scale of their crimes, but what they revealed about the true nature of the SS system. While other Waffen SS formations could claim to be soldiers who occasionally committed war crimes, Dirlewanger's unit existed primarily to commit atrocities, with military effectiveness being a secondary consideration. They were criminals in uniform, authorized and encouraged to indulge their worst impulses in the name of fighting Germany's racial enemies. The origins of the unit traced back to 1940, when Heinrich Himmler authorized an experiment that would test whether convicted criminals could be transformed into useful soldiers through proper ideological indoctrination and military discipline. The concept wasn't entirely unprecedented. Various armies throughout history had used criminal battalions for dangerous missions, but the SS version differed in crucial ways that made it uniquely horrifying. Oskar Dirlewanger himself embodied the contradictions that made his unit possible. A decorated World War I veteran and dedicated Nazi, he possessed genuine military skills combined with psychological tendencies that would have disqualified him from service in any conventional military organization. His criminal record included multiple convictions for sexual assault, financial fraud, and political extremism that had resulted in imprisonment even under the relatively lenient standards of the Weimar Republic. But Himmler saw potential in Dirlewanger's combination of military experience and criminal mentality. The SS leadership was already developing plans for anti-partisan operations in occupied territories that would require soldiers willing to commit acts that conventional military units might find morally difficult. Criminals who had already rejected normal social constraints seemed ideally suited for such missions. The initial recruitment for what became known as the Poachers Unit drew from German prisons, concentration camps, and disciplinary battalions throughout the Reich. The men selected shared certain characteristics: criminal backgrounds, political unreliability, and demonstrated willingness to use violence against defenseless victims. Many were repeat offenders whose crimes included murder, rape, and assault. The training program developed for these men revealed the extent to which SS ideology could corrupt military professionalism. Instead of emphasizing tactical skills and unit cohesion, the curriculum focused on brutalization techniques designed to eliminate any remaining moral constraints. Recruits were required to participate in the execution of prisoners and civilians as part of their combat preparation. SS Scharfer Franz Weber, one of the few unit members who survived the war and provided testimony about their training, later described the systematization of brutality. "We weren't being trained as soldiers. We were being trained as killers. Every exercise involved civilians or prisoners. We learned to see mercy as weakness and cruelty as strength." By the time training was complete, most men had lost any connection to normal human feelings. The unit's first major operation, conducted in occupied Poland during 1941, established patterns that would characterize their activities throughout the war. Officially assigned to eliminate partisan activities in the Lublin district, the Dirlewanger unit instead focused primarily on terrorizing the civilian population through random acts of extreme violence. Their methods went far beyond anything practiced by regular SS formations. Where other units might execute suspected partisans after brief interrogation, Dirlewanger's men engaged in prolonged torture that served no military purpose except intimidation. Where other units might burn villages suspected of supporting resistance activities, Dirlewanger's men would first rape and torture the inhabitants before killing them in ways designed to maximize suffering. The reports filed by Wehrmacht officers who witnessed these operations reveal the extent to which even hardened soldiers were horrified by what they observed. Colonel Hans von Treschow, later executed for his role in the plot to assassinate Hitler, wrote to Army High Command, "The conduct of the Dirlewanger unit exceeds anything that can be justified by military necessity. They are committing acts that violate every principle of civilized warfare and are creating conditions that will make post-war occupation impossible." But such protests were ignored by SS leadership, who saw the unit's extreme brutality as confirmation that their experiment was working. The psychological warfare effects of Dirlewanger operations were undeniable. Civilian populations in areas where they operated displayed levels of terror that exceeded anything achieved through conventional military occupation. The expansion of the unit during 1942 to 43 brought in new categories of personnel that further degraded whatever military capabilities they possessed. Soviet prisoners of war, criminals from occupied territories, and even some German soldiers who had been court-martialed for war crimes were integrated into a formation that increasingly resembled a concentration camp more than a military unit. The addition of the Kaminsky Brigade in 1944 created what may have been the most dysfunctional military formation in modern history. Bronislav Kaminsky, a Russian engineer who had collaborated with German forces, commanded approximately 10,000 men recruited from Soviet deserters, released prisoners, and local collaborators in occupied Belarus. Kaminsky's men brought their own traditions of brutality that combined Russian peasant violence with Soviet-era contempt for human life. When the two units were merged for operations against the Warsaw Uprising, they created a synergy of criminality that exceeded what either group had achieved independently. The Warsaw Uprising provided the ultimate test of whether military formations composed primarily of criminals could achieve tactical objectives while implementing genocidal policies. The mission assigned to the combined Dirlewanger-Kaminsky force was straightforward: suppress the Polish resistance by eliminating the civilian population that supported it. What followed was systematic extermination disguised as military operations. Instead of attempting to distinguish between combatants and non-combatants, the units treated all inhabitants of Warsaw as legitimate targets. Hospitals were burned with patients inside. Schools were converted into execution sites. Churches became mass graves. The tactical performance of these units during the uprising revealed the the fundamental contradiction in using criminals as soldiers. While they displayed remarkable enthusiasm for murdering defenseless civilians, they proved largely ineffective against organized resistance fighters. Polish insurgents, despite being outnumbered and outgunned, consistently outfought the German criminal units in direct combat. SS Hauptsturmführer Erich von dem Boxeluski, the overall commander of German forces in Warsaw, eventually had to commit regular SS and Wehrmacht units to achieve tactical objectives that the criminal formations had proven incapable of accomplishing. His post-war testimony revealed the military limitations of formations based on criminality rather than professional competence. The Dirlewanger and Kaminsky units were capable of terrorizing civilians, but they were useless as combat soldiers. Boxeluski testified. When faced with determined resistance, they often fled or hid while demanding that regular units complete their missions. They were brave only against the defenseless. The dissolution of the Kaminsky Brigade in August 1944, when Kaminsky himself was executed by SS security police for unauthorized looting, illustrated the internal contradictions that made criminal units ultimately unsustainable. Men who had been recruited specifically for their willingness to violate normal social constraints proved impossible to control when their interests conflicted with military objectives. The final phase of Dirlewanger operations, conducted in Slovakia during early 1945, demonstrated how completely the unit had abandoned any pretense of military functionality. Assigned to suppress partisan activities in the Tatra Mountains, they instead focused on looting and terrorizing civilian populations while avoiding contact with actual resistance fighters. When Soviet forces overran their positions in March 1945, most unit members simply deserted, taking whatever valuables they had accumulated and disappearing into the chaos of the collapsing Reich. Unlike regular military formations, which maintained unit cohesion even under desperate conditions, the criminal units dissolved immediately when faced with serious opposition. The historical legacy of the Dirlewanger and Kaminsky brigades extends far beyond their limited military significance. They represented the logical endpoint of SS ideology, the transformation of military formations into instruments of systematic murder without any restraining influence from professional military values. Their existence demonstrated that the SS system was capable of institutionalizing criminality on a scale that exceeded anything previously seen in European warfare. More ominously, they proved that ordinary criminals could be transformed into genocidal killers through proper organization and ideological conditioning. The post-war fate of unit members revealed another disturbing aspect of their operations. Unlike regular SS formations, whose members often claimed to be soldiers who had committed war crimes under orders, the criminal units had been created specifically for criminal purposes. Their members faced prosecution not just for war crimes, but for the civilian crimes that had qualified them for SS service in the first place. Yet many escaped justice entirely, disappearing into the post-war chaos with skills and connections that often allowed them to prosper in the criminal underworld of occupied Europe. The networks they had developed during their SS service proved valuable for smuggling, black market operations, and other criminal activities that flourished in the immediate post-war period. The ultimate significance of the criminal units lay in what they revealed about the potential for institutional corruption of military values. They demonstrated that formations calling themselves military could actually be criminal organizations, and that the uniform and organizational structure of armies could be used to legitimize systematic atrocity. Their existence within the Waffen SS system contaminated the entire organization, making it impossible to separate military achievement from criminal conduct in any meaningful way. War crimes and atrocities. The dark side of military service to photograph would haunt war crimes investigators for decades. Rows of bodies in a snow-covered field outside the Belgian town of Malmedy. American soldiers murdered in cold blood on December 17, 1944. But as SS Oberfuhrer Hermann Priest stood trial before Allied judges in 1946, This single atrocity represented only the visible tip of an iceberg that had been building for 7 years of increasingly brutal warfare. The systematic criminal conduct of Waffen SS formations wasn't an aberration or the product of combat stress. It was the inevitable result of an organizational culture that had always subordinated military professionalism to racial ideology. The challenge facing post-war investigators was immense. Unlike the Holocaust, which had been implemented primarily by specialized units like the Einsatzgruppen and camp personnel, Waffen SS war crimes had been committed by combat formations during active military operations across 3 continents. The perpetrators were often the same soldiers who had displayed remarkable courage and tactical skill in conventional military engagements, creating a complex legacy that defied simple moral categorization. The patterns of criminality that characterized Waffen SS operations had emerged gradually, beginning with the invasion of Poland in 1939 and escalating systematically throughout the war. What started as isolated incidents of unauthorized violence had evolved into systematic policies that made war crimes integral to SS military doctrine. The transformation began during the earliest phases of SS military development, when Heinrich Himmler explicitly authorized the integration of ideological objectives with conventional military missions. Unlike regular Wehrmacht units, which were theoretically restricted to purely military targets, SS formations received broad authorization to eliminate enemies of the Reich, however they might be encountered. This authorization created an institutional culture where the distinction between military and criminal objectives became increasingly meaningless. SS officers learned to view civilian populations in occupied territories not as non-combatants protected by international law, but as potential enemies whose elimination served legitimate military purposes. The invasion of Poland provided the first systematic implementation of these policies. SS formations participating in the campaign received explicit orders to eliminate Polish intellectuals, clergy, and political leaders who might organize resistance to German occupation. These orders, distributed through normal military channels, treated systematic murder as a routine military objective. SS Oberfuhrer Udo von Warsch, commanding SS units during the Polish campaign, issued typical instructions to his subordinates. All actions against hostile elements must be conducted with maximum effectiveness. Local commanders are authorized to eliminate threats to German security using whatever methods they deem appropriate. No restrictions apply to operations against racially inferior populations. Such orders created a command climate where war crimes became not just permissible, but expected. Junior officers understood that their professional advancement depended on demonstrating enthusiasm for implementing racial policies, while ordinary soldiers learned that criminal conduct would be rewarded rather than punished. The systematic nature of these crimes was revealed through post-war investigations that documented the bureaucratic apparatus supporting SS atrocities. War crimes weren't spontaneous outbreaks of violence by stressed soldiers, but carefully planned operations that required coordination between multiple organizational levels. The massacre at Oradour-sur-Glane in June 1944 exemplified this systematic approach. When the 2nd SS Panzer Division Das Reich received reports of partisan activity in the region, their response wasn't limited to pursuing actual resistance fighters. Instead, they implemented a comprehensive pacification operation designed to eliminate the entire civilian population that might support partisan activities. The operation was planned with the same attention to detail that characterized successful military engagements. Reconnaissance units identified escape routes that needed to be blocked. Communications specialists coordinated timing to prevent civilian evacuation. Combat engineers prepared incendiary devices specifically designed for burning buildings with people inside. When the operation was executed on June 10, 1944, it proceeded according to predetermined procedures that had been developed through years of experience in occupied territories. The 642 inhabitants of Oradour-sur-Glane were systematically murdered using methods that had been refined during previous operations. Their village destroyed so completely that it could never be rebuilt. SS Sturmbannführer Adolf Dieckmann, who who commanded the operation, filed a routine after-action report that treated the massacre as a successful anti-partisan mission. Oradour-sur-Glane has been eliminated as a center of terrorist activity. All hostile elements have been neutralized, and the area is now secure for German operations. The bureaucratic language couldn't disguise the reality that an entire community had been murdered to demonstrate the consequences of supporting resistance activities. But within the SS command structure, such operations were considered evidence of tactical innovation and ideological commitment that merited commendation rather than investigation. The Eastern Front provided opportunities for war crimes on a scale that dwarfed anything previously seen in European warfare. The explicit definition of the Soviet campaign as a war of racial extermination authorized SS formations to treat enemy soldiers and civilians as subhuman entities unprotected by international law. The implementation of the Commissar Order, which directed all German forces to execute captured Soviet political officers, revealed how military directives could legitimize systematic murder. But SS formations went far beyond the specific requirements of this order, interpreting it as general authorization to eliminate any Soviet personnel who might be classified as ideologically dangerous. The 3rd SS Panzer Division Totenkopf, commanded by SS Oberfuhrer Theodor Eicke, established procedures for processing Soviet prisoners that virtually guaranteed systematic murder. Instead of following Wehrmacht guidelines for prisoner interrogation and classification, Totenkopf developed screening criteria that identified most captured personnel as commissars subject to immediate execution. These criteria were so broad that they effectively criminalized normal military service in the Soviet armed forces. Officers were executed for holding leadership positions. Educated soldiers were executed for potential political reliability. Jewish soldiers were executed for racial reasons. The result was systematic elimination of prisoners who should have been protected by international law. SS Hauptsturmführer Max Simon, serving as a regimental commander in Totenkopf, later described the psychological mechanisms that made such crimes possible. We have been taught that Bolsheviks weren't really human beings, just dangerous animals that needed to be eliminated for European security. When you see prisoners that way, killing them doesn't seem like murder. It seems like pest control. This dehumanization of enemy personnel was reinforced through systematic propaganda that portrayed SS soldiers as defenders of European civilization against Asiatic barbarism. The racial ideology that had always been central to SS identity provided psychological justification for crimes that would have been impossible under normal military conditions. The anti-partisan warfare that characterized much of the Eastern Front created additional opportunities for systematic criminality. SS formations were authorized to implement collective punishment policies that held entire civilian populations responsible for resistance activities, regardless of individual involvement. These policies were applied with devastating consistency throughout occupied territories. Villages suspected of supporting partisans were burned with their inhabitants. Civilians found in areas of partisan activity were executed as accomplices. Most horrifically, SS units implemented systematic reprisal policies that murdered dozens of civilians for every German soldier killed by resistance fighters. The 1st SS Infantry Brigade, operating in the Soviet Union during 1941 to 42, established procedures that became standard throughout SS formations engaged in anti-partisan operations. Their standing order specified that all males between ages 15 and 65 found in partisan areas should be executed, while women and children should be deported for forced labor. These orders were implemented with bureaucratic efficiency that reflected years of institutional development. SS units maintained detailed records of reprisal operations, documenting the number of civilians executed and the military justification for each action. The systematic nature of these records indicated that war crimes had become routine administrative functions rather than exceptional responses to tactical situations. The involvement of SS formations in Holocaust implementation revealed the extent to which military units could be integrated into genocidal operations. While most direct killing was conducted by specialized units like the Einsatzgruppen, combat formations provided security, transportation, and logistical support that made systematic extermination possible. The 1st SS Cavalry Brigade participated directly in mass murder operations during the early phases of Holocaust implementation in occupied Poland and the Soviet Union. Their mobile capabilities made them ideal for eliminating Jewish communities in remote areas where specialized killing units weren't available. These operations combined military efficiency with genocidal objectives in ways that demonstrated how completely traditional military skills could be corrupted by criminal purposes. SS cavalry units would surround Jewish communities, process the inhabitants through systematic selection procedures, then execute them using military weapons and tactics. The bureaucratic records maintained by these units revealed the extent to which Holocaust participation had been integrated into normal military operations. Daily reports included body counts alongside conventional military statistics, treating systematic murder as a routine aspect of operational success. Post-war investigations uncovered over 30,000 documented cases of war crimes committed by Waffen SS formations, involving hundreds of thousands of victims across all theaters of operation. These statistics represented only incidents that could be proven through documentary evidence and survivor testimony. The actual scope of SS criminality was certainly much larger. The systematic nature of these crimes indicated that they weren't aberrations committed by a few bad units, but the logical result of an organizational culture that had always emphasized racial ideology over professional military values. The same institutional characteristics that made SS formations tactically effective, absolute obedience, aggressive initiative, unit cohesion, also made them capable of implementing systematic murder with unprecedented efficiency. The post-war trials of SS personnel revealed the psychological mechanisms that had made such extensive criminality possible. Many defendants claimed they were simply following orders, but the evidence indicated that SS culture had created conditions where criminal orders were not just obeyed, but anticipated and exceeded by subordinates eager to demonstrate their ideological commitment. The ultimate significance of Waffen SS war crimes lay not in their scale, though that was unprecedented, but in what they revealed about the potential for military organizations to become instruments of systematic murder when professional values are subordinated to ideological objectives. Their criminal legacy would forever overshadow whatever military achievements individual units had accomplished, making it impossible to separate tactical excellence from moral corruption in any meaningful evaluation of their historical significance.